Essays in Historical Materialism, George Plekhanov, Foreign Languages Press, Foreign Languages Press, Collection, Foundations. #9. Contact, Redspark, contact@protonmail.com, https, Foreign Languages, Press, Paris, 2020, ISBN, 978-2, 491,182, 37-3. The th edition of the Essays in Historical Materialism is a reprint of the 1940 edition, published by international publishers, with some additional notes and corrections that were added from the Lawrence and Wishart edition of 1961. This book is under license attribution non-commercial share-alike 4 International, CC by NCSA 4, https, creativecommons.org, licenses by NCSA 4 Torte. Euro. Contents. The Materialist Conception of History. Chapter 1. Chapter 2-4. Chapter 3. Chapter 4. 12. Chapter 15. Chapter 6. 18. Chapter 7-22. Chapter 8-25. Chapter 9-29. Chapter 24. Chapter 38. The Role of the Individual in History. Chapter 1-45. Show. Chapter 2-48. Chapter 3-53. Chapter 4-57. Chapter 5-61. Chapter 68. Chapter 70-77. Chapter 8-81. The Materia. List. Conception of History. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. We must confess that it was with no little prejudice that we took up the book of this Roman professor. We had been rather frightened by certain works of some of his compatriots, Loria, for example. See in particular, La Teoria Economica della Constituzione Politica, But a perusal of the very first pages was enough to convince us that we had been mistaken, and that Achille Loria is one thing, and Antonio Labriola another. And when we reached the end of the book, we felt that we would like to discuss it with the Russian reader. We hope that he will not be annoyed with us, for after all, so rare are books that are not banal. Labriola's book first appeared in Italian. The French translation is clumsy, and in places positively infelicitous. We say this without hesitation, although we have not the Italian original before us. But the Italian author cannot be held responsible for the French translator. At any rate, Labriola's ideas are clear even in the clumsy French translation. Let us examine them. Mr. Karyev, who, as we know, very zealously reads, and most successfully manages to distort every work having any relation at all to the materialist conception of history, would probably inscribe our author in the list of economic materialists. 1. But that would be wrong. Labriola firmly and fairly consistently adheres to the materialist conception of history, but he does not regard himself as an economic materialist. He is of the opinion that this title applies more fittingly to writers like Thorold Rogers than to himself, and those who think like him. And that is perfectly true, although at a first glance it may not seem quite clear. Narodnik or subjectivists. What is an economic materialist? And he will answer that an economic materialist is one who attributes predominant importance to the economic factor in social life. That is how our Narodniks and subjectivists understand economic materialism. And it must be confessed that there undoubtedly are people. 1. The contemporary English-speaking reader is more familiar with this concept under the term economic determinist, just as economic determinism is widely used for Plekhanov's economic materialism. ADD 1. So, the materialist conception of history, who attribute to the economic factor a predominant role in the life of human society. Mr. Mikhailovsky has more than once cited Louis Blanc as one who had spoken of the predominance of this factor long before a certain master of certain Russian disciples. But one thing we do not understand. Why did our venerable subjective sociologist pick on Louis Blanc? He should have known that in this respect, Louis Blanc had many predecessors. Guizot, Mignet, Augustin Thierry, and Tocqueville. All recognized the predominant role of the economic factor. Consequently, all these historians were economic materialists. In our days, the said Thorold Rogers, in his economic interpretation of history, also revealed himself as a convinced economic materialist. He too recognized the predominant importance of the economic factor. It is not to be concluded from this, of course, that Thorold Rogers' social and political views were identical with those, say, of Louis Blanc. Rogers held the view of the bourgeois economists, whereas Louis Blanc was at one time an exponent of utopian socialism. If Rogers had been asked what he thought of the bourgeois economic system, he would have said that at the basis of this system lie the fundamental attributes of human nature, and that, consequently, the history of its rise is the history of the gradual removal of obstacles that at one time hindered, and even totally precluded, the manifestation of these attributes. Louis Blanc, on the other hand, would have declared that capitalism itself was one of the obstacles raised by ignorance and violence to the creation of an economic system which would at last really correspond to human nature. This, as you see, is a very material difference. Who would be nearer to the truth? To be frank, we think that both these writers were almost equally remote from it, but we have neither the wish nor the opportunity to dwell on this point here. What is important to us just now is something else. We would request the reader to observe that in the opinion of both Louis Blanc and Thorold Rogers, the economic factor which predominates in social life was itself, as the mathematicians put it, a function of human nature, and chiefly of the human mind and human knowledge. The same must be said of Chapter 1, the above-mentioned French historians of the Restoration period. Well, and what name shall we give to the views on history of people, who, although they assert that the economic factor predominates in social life, yet are convinced that this factor the economics of society is in its turn the fruit of human knowledge and ideas. Such views can only be called idealistic. We thus find that economic materialism does not necessarily preclude historical idealism, and even that is not quite accurate. We say that it does not necessarily preclude idealism, but what we should say is that perhaps, as it has been mostly hitherto, it is nothing but a variety of idealism. After this, it will be clear why men like Antonio Labriola do not regard themselves as economic materialists. It is because they are consistent materialists, and because, as regards history, their views are the direct opposite of historical idealism. 3. The materialist conception of history. Chapter Eyes. However, Mr. Kudrin will probably tell us, you, with the habit common to many of the disciples, are resorting to paradoxes, are juggling with words, deceiving the eye and sword-swallowing. As you put it, it is the idealists who are economic materialists. But in that case, what would you have us understand by genuine and consistent materialists? Do they reject the idea of the predominance of the economic factor? Do they believe that side by side with this factor there are other factors operating in history, and that it would be vain for us to investigate which of them predominates over all the others? We can only rejoice at the genuine and consistent materialists if they really are averse to dragging in the economic factor everywhere. Me? No. Our reply to Mr. Kudrin is that, indeed, the genuine and consistent materialists really are averse to dragging in the economic factor everywhere. What is more, even to ask which factor predominates in social life seems to them pointless. But Mr. Kudrin need not hurry to rejoice. It was by no means under the influence of Messrs. the Narodniks and subjectivists that the genuine and consistent materialists arrived at this conviction. The objections these gentlemen raised to the domination of the economic factor are only calculated to evoke hilarity among the genuine and consistent materialists. What is more, these objections of our friends, the Narodniks and subjectivists, are rather belated. The inappropriateness of asking which factor predominates in social life became very noticeable, even in the time of Hegel. Hegelian idealism precluded the very possibility of such questions. All the more is precluded by modern dialectical materialism. Since the appearance of the critique of critical criticism, and especially since the publication of Marx's well-known critique of political economy, only people backward in theory are capable of wrangling about the relative importance of the various historico-social factors. We are quite aware that Mr. Kudrin is not the only one who will be surprised at this, and so we hasten to explain. What are the historico-social factors? How does the idea of them? 4. Chapter 2. Originate? Let us take an example. The Gracchi tried to check the process of appropriation of the public domain by the wealthy Romans, which was so fatal to Rome. The wealthy Romans resisted the Gracchi. A struggle ensued. Each of the contending sides passionately pursued its own aims. If I wanted to describe this struggle, I might depict it as a conflict of human passions. Passions would thus appear as factors in the internal history of Rome. But in this struggle, both the Gracchi and their adversaries took advantage of the weapons furnished them by Roman public law. I would not fail, of course, to speak of this in my narrative, and thus Roman public law would also appear as a factor in the internal development of the Roman Republic. Further, the people who opposed the Gracchi had a material interest in preserving a deep-rooted abuse. The people who supported the Gracchi had a material interest in abolishing it. I would mention this circumstance too, and as a result, the struggle I am describing would appear as a conflict of material interests, as a conflict of classes, a conflict of the poor and the rich. And so I already have a third factor, and this time the most interesting of all, the famous economic factor. If you have the time and inclination, dear reader, you may discuss at length which of the factors in the internal development of Rome predominated over the rest. You will find in my historical narrative sufficient data to support any opinion on this subject. As for myself, as long as I stick to the role of simple narrator, I shall not worry much about the factors. Their relative importance does not interest me. As a narrator, my one task is to depict the given events in as accurate and lively a manner as possible. For this purpose, I have to establish a certain, even if only outward, connection between them, and to arrange them in a certain perspective. If I mention the passions that stirred the contending parties, or the system prevailing in Rome at the time, or lastly, the inequality of property that existed there, I do so with the sole purpose of presenting a connected and lively account of the events. If I achieve this purpose, I shall be quite satisfied, and shall unconcernedly leave it to the philosophers to decide whether passions. 5. The materialist conception of history predominate over economics, or economics over passions, or lastly, maybe that nothing predominates over anything, each factor following the golden rule. Live and let live. All this will be so as long as I stick to the role of simple narrator, to whom all inclination to subtle speculation is foreign. But what if I do not stick to this role and start philosophizing about the events I am describing? I shall then not be satisfied with a mere outward connecton of events. I shall want to disclose their inherent causes, and those same factors, human passions, public law, and economics, which I formerly stressed and gave prominence to, guided almost exclusively by artistic instinct, will now acquire a new and vast importance in my eyes. They will appear to me to be those sought-for inherent causes, those latent forces to whose influence events are to be attributed. I shall create a theory of factors, and indeed, one or another variety of such a theory is bound to arise whenever people who are interested in social phenomena pass from simply contemplating and describing them to investigating the connections that exist between them. The theory of factors, moreover, grows with the growing division of labor in social science. All of the branches of this science, ethics, politics, jurisprudence, political economy, etc., investigate one and the same thing, the activity of social man. But each investigates it from its own special angle. Mr. Mikhailovsky would say that each of them controls a special chord. Each of the chords may be regarded as a factor of social development. And in fact, we may now count almost as many factors as there are distinct disciplines in social science. We hope that what is meant by the historico-social factors and how the idea of them originates will now be clear. A historico-social factor is an abstraction, and the idea of it originates as the result of a process of abstraction. Thanks to the process of abstraction, various sides of the social complex assume the form of separate categories, and the various manifestations and expressions of the activity of social man, morals, law, economic forms, etc., are converted in our minds into separate forces which appear to give rise to a noun. 6. Chapter 2. Determine this activity and to be its ultimate causes. Once the theory of factors had come into being, disputes were bound to arise as to which factor was to be considered the predominant one. 7. The materialist conception of history. Chapter 3. The factors are subject to reciprocal action. Each influences the rest and is in its turn influenced by the rest. The result is such an intricate web of reciprocal influences, of direct actions and reflected reactions, that whoever sets out to elucidate the course of social development begins to feel his head swim and experiences an unconquerable necessity to find at least some sort of clue out of the labyrinth. Since bitter experience has taught him that the view of reciprocal action only leads to dizziness, he begins to seek for another view. He tries to simplify his task. He asks himself whether one of the historico-social factors is not the prime and basic cause of all the rest. If he succeeded in finding an affirmative answer to this basic question, his task would indeed be immeasurably simplified. Let us suppose that he reaches the conviction that the rise and development of all the social relations of any particular country are determined by the course of its intellectual development, which, in its turn, is determined by the attributes of human nature, the idealist view. He will then easily escape from the vicious circle of reciprocal action and create a more or less harmonious and consistent theory of social development. Subsequently, as a result of a further study of the subject, he may perhaps perceive that he was mistaken, and that man's intellectual development cannot be regarded as the prime cause of all social movement. Admitting his mistake, he will probably at the same time observe that his temporary conviction that the intellectual factor dominates over all the rest was after all of some use to him, for without it he could never have escaped from the blind alley of reciprocal action, and would not have advanced a single step towards an understanding of social phenomena. It would be unfair to condemn such attempts to establish some hierarchy among the factors of historico-social development. They were just as indispensable in their time as the appearance of the theory of factors itself was inevitable. Antonio Labriola, who has given a fuller and better analysis of this theory than any other materialist writer, quite rightly remarks that the historic factors indicate something which is atheist. Chapter 3. Much less than the truth, but much more than a simple error. The theory of factors has contributed its mite to the benefit of science. The separate study of the historico-social factors has served, like any other empirical study which does not transcend the apparent movement of things, to improve the instrument of observation, and to permit us to find again, in the facts themselves, which have been artificially abstracted, the keystones which bind them into the social complexus. Today, a knowledge of the special social sciences is indispensable to anyone who would reconstruct any portion of man's past life. Historical science would not have got very far without philology, and the one-sided Romanists, who believed that Roman law was dictated by reason itself, was it any mean service they rendered to science? But however legitimate and useful the theory of factors may have been in its time, today it will not stand the light of criticism. It dismembers the activity of social man and converts its various aspects and manifestations into separate forces, which are supposed to determine the historical movement of society. In the development of social science, this theory has played a part similar to that played by the theory of separate physical forces in natural science. The progress of natural science has led to the theory of the unity of these forces, to the modern theory of energy. In just the same way, the progress of social science was bound to lead to the replacement of the theory of factors, that fruit of social analysis, by a synthetic view of social life. This synthetic view of social life is not peculiar to modern dialectical materialism. We already find it in Hegel, who conceived the task to be to find a scientific explanation of the entire historico-social process in its totality, that is, among other things, including all those aspects and manifestations of the activity of social man, which people with an abstract cast of thought pictured as separate factors. But as an absolute idealist, Hegel explained the activities of social man by the attributes of the universal spirit. Given these attributes, the whole history of mankind is given in sich, and its ultimate results as well. Hegel's synthetic view was at the same time a teleological view. Modern dialectical materialism has completely eliminated teleology from social science. 9. The materialist conception of history. It has shown that man makes his history not in order to march along a line of predetermined progress, and not because he must obey the laws of some abstract, metaphysical, Labriola calls it, evolution. He does so in the endeavor to satisfy his own needs, and it is for science to explain how the various methods of satisfying these needs influence man's social relations and spiritual activity, the methods by which social man satisfies his needs, and to a large extent, these needs themselves are determined by the nature of the implements with which he subjugates nature in one degree or another. In other words, they are determined by the state of his productive forces. Every considerable change in the state of these forces is reflected in man's social relations, and therefore in his economic relations as part of these social relations. The idealists of all species and varieties held that economic relations were functions of human nature. The dialectical materialists hold that these relations are functions of the social productive forces. It therefore follows that if the dialectical materialists thought it permissible to speak of factors of social development with any other purpose than to criticize these antiquated fictions, they would first of all have to rebuke the so-called economic materialists for the inconstancy of their predominant factor. The modern materialists do not know of any economic system that would be alone conformable to human nature, all other social economic systems being the result of one or another degree of violence to human nature. The modern materialists teach that any economic system that is conformable to the state of the productive forces at the given time is conformable to human nature. And conversely, any economic system begins to contradict the demands of human nature as soon as it comes into contradiction with the state of the productive forces. The predominant factor is thus found to be itself subordinate to another factor. And that being the case, how can it be called predominant? If that is so, then it is evident that a veritable gulf divides the dialectical materialists from those who, not without justification, may be called economic materialists. And to what trend do those altogether? 10. Chapter 3. Unpleasant disciples of a not altogether pleasant teacher, belong whom Messrs. Karayev and Mikhailovsky, S. Grivenko and other clever and learned people quite recently attacked so vehemently, if not so happily. If we are not mistaken, the disciples fully adhered to the view of dialectical materialism. Why then did Messrs. Karayev and Mikhailovsky, S. Kravchenko and the other clever and learned people father on them the views of the economic materialists and fulminate against them for supposedly attaching exaggerated importance to the economic factor. It may be presumed that these clever and learned people did so because the arguments of the late lamented economic materialists are easier to refute than the arguments of the dialectical materialists. Again, it may be presumed that our learned opponents of the disciples have but poorly grasped the latter's views. This presumption is even the more probable one. It may be objected that the disciples themselves sometimes called themselves economic materialists, and that the term economic materialism was first used by one of the French disciples. That is so. But neither the French nor the Russian disciples ever associated with the term economic materialism the idea which our Narodniks and the subjectivists associate with it. We have only to recall that in the opinion of Mr. N. Mikhailovsky, Louis Blanc, and Mr. Y. Shukovsky were economic materialists, just like our present-day supporters of the materialist view of history. Confusion of concepts could go no further. 11. The materialist conception of history. Chapter 4. By entirely eliminating teleology from social science and explaining the activity of social man by his needs and by the means and methods of satisfying them, prevailing at the given time. Dialectical Materialism it will, for the first time, imparts to this science the strictness of which her sister, the science of nature, would often boast over her. It may be said that the science of society is itself becoming a natural science. Notre doctrine naturaliste d'histoire, as Labriola justly says. But this does not mean that he merges the sphere of biology with the sphere of social science. Labriola is an ardent opponent of Darwinism, political and social, which has, like an epidemic, for many years invaded the mind of more than one thinker, and many more of the advocates and declaimers of sociology, and as a fashionable habit, has even influenced the language of practical men of politics. Man is without doubt an animal connected by ties of affinity to other animals. He has no privileges of origin. His organism is nothing more than a particular case of general physiology. Originally, like all other animals, he was completely under the sway of his natural environment, which was not yet subject to his modifying action. He had to adapt himself to it in his struggle for existence. In Labriola's opinion, races are a result of such direct adaptation to natural environment, insofar as they differ in physical features, as, for example, the white, black, and yellow races, and do not represent secondary historico-social formations, that is to say, nations and peoples. The primitive instincts of sociability and the first rudiments of sexual selection similarly arose as a consequence of adaptation to natural environment in the struggle for existence. But our ideas of primitive man are merely conjectures. All men who inhabit the earth today, like all who in the past were observed by trustworthy investigators, are found, and were found, already quite a long way removed from the moment when man ceased to live a purely animal life. The Iroquois Indians, for example, with their maternal Wandi. Labriola calls it historical materialism, a term borrowed from Engels. 12. Chapter 4. Gents studied and described by Morgan had already made a comparatively big advance along the road of social development. Even the present-day Australians not only have a language which may be called a condition and instrument, a cause and effect of social life, are not only acquainted with the use of fire, but live in societies possessing a definite structure, with definite customs and institutions. The Australian tribes have their own territory and their art of hunting. They have certain weapons of defense and attack, certain utensils for the preservation of supplies, certain methods of ornamenting the body. In a word, the Australian already lives in a definite, although to be sure very elementary, artificial environment to which he accordingly adapts himself from earliest childhood. This artificial social environment is an essential condition for all further progress. The degree of its development serves as a measure of the degree of savagery or barbarism of all other tribes. This primary social formation corresponds to what is called the prehistory of man. The beginning of historical life presumes an even greater development of the artificial environment and a far greater power of man over nature. The complex internal relations of societies entering on the path of historical development are by no means due to the immediate influence of natural environment. They presuppose the invention of certain implements of labor, the domestication of certain animals, the ability to extract certain metals, and the like. These implements and means of production changed in very different ways in different circumstances. They showed signs of progress, stagnation, or even retrogression, but never have these changes returned man to a purely animal life, that is, to a life directly influenced by the natural environment. Historical science has, then, as its first and principal object, the determination and investigation of this artificial foundation, its origin, its composition, its changes, and its transformations. To say that all this is only a part and prolongation of nature is to say a thing which by its too abstract and too generic character has no longer any meaning. Nay, critical as he is of political and social Darwinism, Labriola is no less critical of the efforts of certain amiable dilettantes to combine the two. 13. The materialist conception of history. Materialist conception of history with the theory of universal evolution, which, as he harshly but justly remarks, many have converted into a mere metaphysical metaphor. He also scoffs at the naivete of amiable dilettantes in trying to place the materialist conception of history under the patronage of the philosophy of Auguste Comte or Spencer, which is to say that they wish to give us for our allies our most open adversaries, he says. The remark about dilettantes evidently refers, among others, to Professor Enrico Ferri, the author of a very superficial book entitled Spencer, Darwin, and Marx, which has been published in a French translation under the title Socialisme et Science Positive. 14. Chapter 5. Thus, man makes history in striving to satisfy his needs. These needs, of course, are originally imposed by nature, but they are later considerably modified, quantitatively and qualitatively, by the character of the artificial environment. The productive forces at man's disposal determine all his social relations. First of all, a state of the productive forces determines the relations in which men stand towards each other in the social process of production, that is, their economic relations. These relations naturally give rise to definite interests, which are expressed in law. Every system of law protects a definite interest, Labriola says. That a development of productive forces divides society into classes, whose interests are not only different, but in many, and, moreover essential, aspects are diametrically antagonistic. This antagonism of interests gives rise to conflicts, to a struggle among the social classes. The struggle results in the replacement of the tribal organization by the state organization, the purpose of which is to protect the dominant interests. Lastly, social relations, determined by the given state of productive forces, give rise to common morality. The morality, that is, that guides people in their common, everyday life. Thus the law, the state system, and the morality of any given people are determined directly and immediately by its characteristic economic relations. These economic relations also determine, but indirectly and mediately, all of the creations of the mind and imagination, art, science, etc. To understand the history of scientific thought, or the history of art in any particular country, it is not enough to be acquainted with its economics. One must know how to proceed from economics to social psychology, without a careful study and grasp of which a materialist explanation of the history of ideologies is impossible. That does not mean, of course, that there is a social soul or a collective national spirit developing in accordance with its own special laws and manifesting itself in social life. That is pure mysticism, Labriola says. All that the materialist can speak of in this case is the era. 15. The materialist conception of history. prevailing state of sentiment and thought in the particular social class of the particular country at the particular time. This state of sentiment and thought is the result of social relations. Labriola is firmly persuaded that it is not the forms of man's consciousness that determine the forms of his social being, but, on the contrary, the forms of his social being that determine the forms of his consciousness. But once the forms of his consciousness have sprung from the soil of social being, they become a part of history. Historical science cannot limit itself to the mere anatomy of society. It embraces the totality of phenomena that are directly or indirectly determined by social economics, including the work of the imagination. There is no historical fact that did not owe its origin to social economics, but it is no less true to say that there is no historical fact that was not preceded, not accompanied, and not succeeded by a definite state of consciousness. Hence, the tremendous importance of social psychology. For if it has to be reckoned with even in the history of law and of political institutions, in the history of literature, art, philosophy, and so forth, not a single step can be taken without it. When we say that a given work is fully in the spirit of, let us say, the Renaissance, it means that it completely corresponds with the then prevailing sentiments of the classes which set the tone in social life. So long as the social relations do not change, the psychology of society does not change either. People get accustomed to the prevailing beliefs, concepts, modes of thought, and means of satisfying given aesthetic requirements. But should the development of productive forces lead to any substantial change in the economic structure of society, and, as a consequence, in the reciprocal relations of the social classes, the psychology of these classes will also change, and with it the spirit of the times and the national character. This change is manifested in the appearance of new religious beliefs or new philosophical concepts, of new trends in art or new aesthetic requirements. Another thing to be borne in mind, in Labriola's opinion, is that in ideologies, a very important part is often played by the survivals of concepts and trends inherited from earlier generations and preserved only by tradition. Furthermore, ideologies are also influenced by nature. 16. Chapter 5. As we already know, the artificial environment very powerfully modifies the influence of nature on social man. From a direct influence, it becomes an indirect influence, but it does not cease to exist for that. The temperament of every nation preserves certain peculiarities, induced by the influence of the natural environment, which are to a certain extent modified, but never completely destroyed, by adaptation to the social environment. These peculiarities of national temperament constitute what is known as race. Race exercises an undoubted influence on the history of some ideologies, art for example, and this still further complicates the already far from easy task of explaining it scientifically. 17. The materialist conception of history. Chapter 6. We have set forth in fair detail, and we hope, accuracy, Labriola's view that social phenomena depend on the economic structure of society, which, in its turn, is determined by the state of its productive forces. For the most part, we are in full agreement with him, but in places his views give rise to certain doubts, concerning which we would like to make a few remarks. Take the following point to begin with. According to Labriola, the state is an organization for the rule of one social class over another or others. That is so, but it scarcely expresses the whole truth. In states like China or ancient Egypt, where civilized life was impossible without highly complex and extensive works for the regulation of the flow and overflow of big rivers and for irrigation purposes, the rise of the state may be largely explained by the direct influence of the needs of the social productive process. There can be no doubt that inequality, in one or another degree, existed in these countries, even in prehistoric times, both within the tribes that went to constitute the state, which often differed completely in ethnographical origin, and among the tribes. But the ruling classes we meet with in the history of these countries held their more or less exalted social position owing to the state organization called into being by the needs of the social productive process. There is scarcely room for doubt that the Egyptian priestly caste owed their supremacy to the highly important part which their rudimentary scientific knowledge played in the system of Egyptian agriculture. In the West, where Greece, of course, must be included, we do not observe that the direct needs of the social process of production, which there did not entail any extensive social organization, had any influence on the rise of the state. But even there, the appearance of the state must in a large measure be attributed to the need for a social division of labor. 3. One of the Chaldean kings says, "I have mastered the secrets of the rivers for the benefit of man. I have led the waters of the rivers into the wilderness. I have filled the parched ditches with them. I have watered the desert plains. I have brought them fertility and abundance. I have turned them into habitations of joy." For all its boastfulness, this is a fairly accurate description of the role of the Oriental state in organizing the social process of production. 18. Chapter 6. Called forth by the development of the social productive forces. This, of course, did not prevent the state from being at the same time an organization of the rule of a privileged minority over a more or less enslaved majority. But it must not be lost sight of under any circumstances. If an incorrect and one-sided idea of the historical role of the state is to be avoided. And now let us examine Labriola's views on the historical development of ideologies. We have seen that, in his opinion, this development is complicated by the action of racial peculiarities and by the influence exercised on man by his natural environment generally. It is a great pity that our author did not think it necessary to support and explain this opinion by any illustrations. It would have made it easier for us to understand him. At any rate, it is clear that it cannot be accepted in the form in which he expounds it. The American redskin tribes do not, of course, belong to the same race as the tribes which in prehistoric times inhabited the Greek archipelago or the Baltic coast. It is beyond question that in these different localities, primitive man experienced the influences of the natural environment in very different ways. It might have been expected that these different influences would be reflected in the rudimentary art of the primitive inhabitants of the localities mentioned. Yet, we do not observe this to be the case. In all parts of the earth, however much they may differ from each other, we find similar stages in the development of art corresponding to similar stages in the development of primitive man. We know of the art of the Stone Age and of the art of the Iron Age, but we do not know of any distinctive arts of the different races, white, yellow, etc. The state of the productive forces is reflected even in details. For example, in pottery ornamentations we first meet only with straight and broken lines, squares, crosses, zigzags, etc. This form of ornamentation was borrowed by primitive art from the even more primitive handicrafts, weaving and plating. In the Bronze Age, with the appearance art, just as in certain cases it did not prevent it from being an outcome of the conquest of one people by another. Force plays a big part in the replacement of old institutions by new. But force can in no way explain either the possibility of such a replacement or its social consequences. 19. The materialist conception of history. Of the art of working metals, which are capable of assuming all sorts of geometrical shapes, we observe the appearance of curved ornamentations. And lastly, with the domestication of animals, their figures, and especially the figure of the horse, make their appearance. 5. To be sure, in the depictions of human beings, the influence of racial features was bound to affect the ideals of beauty, peculiar to the primitive artists. We know that every race, especially in its early stages of social development, considers itself the most beautiful and rates very highly the features that distinguish it from other races. But, firstly, the influence of these peculiarities of racial aesthetics, as far as they have any permanency at all, cannot alter the course of development of art. And secondly, these peculiarities themselves have only a temporary durability, lasting. That is, only as long as certain definite conditions prevail. When a tribe is forced to admit the superiority of another, more developed tribe, its racial complacency tends to disappear and gives place to an imitation of alien tastes which were formerly considered ridiculous or even shameful and disgusting. Here we find occurring to the savage what occurs to the peasant in civilized society, who at first scoffs at the manners and dress of the town dweller, and then, with the growing supremacy of the town over the country, tries to copy them to the best of his ability. Passing to historical nations, we must first point out that in relation to them, the word race cannot and should not be used at all. We do not know of any historical nation that can be regarded as racially pure. Each of them is the product of an extremely lengthy and intense process of interbreeding and intermingling of different ethnic elements. Now try, after this, to determine the influence of race on the history of the ideologies of any nation. At a first glance, it seems that nothing could be simpler and more correct than the idea that natural environment influences national temperament, and, through temperament, the history of the nation's intellectual and aesthetic development. But if Labriola had only recalled the history of his own country, he 5. See Wilhelm Lübke's Introduction to his History of Art. 6. See Charles Darwin, Descent of Man. 20. Chapter 6. Would have been convinced of the erroneousness of this idea. The modern Italians are surrounded by the same natural environment as that in which the ancient Romans lived, yet how unlike is the temperament of our modern tributaries of Menelik to the temperament of the stern conquerors of Carthage. If we were to undertake to explain the history of Italian art, for example, by the Italian temperament, we should very soon be confronted by the baffling question, why this temperament, for its part, varied so profoundly at different times and in different parts of the Apennine Peninsula. 21. The Materialist Conception of History. Chapter 70. The author of the Essays on the Gogol Period in Russian Literature says in one of his commentaries to the first volume of J.S. Mill's work on political economy, "We would not say that race has no significance whatever. The development of the natural and historical sciences has not yet reached such perfection of analysis as to enable us in most cases to say unreservedly, here that element is absolutely lacking. For all we know, this steel pen may contain a particle of platinum. It cannot be denied, absolutely. All we can say is that chemical analysis shows that this pen contains such a quantity of undoubtedly steel particles that the portion of its composition that might consist of platinum is perfectly negligible. And even if such a portion did exist, it could be ignored for all practical purposes. As far as practical action is concerned, you may treat this pen as you would steel pens in general. In just the same way, pay no attention in practical affairs to people's race. Treat them simply as people. It may be that the race of a nation did have some influence in determining that its state today is what it is, and no other. It cannot be denied absolutely. Historical analysis has not yet achieved mathematical and absolute accuracy. Like present-day chemical analysis, it still leaves a very small, residuum, which demands more subtle methods of investigation, methods that are still unavailable in the present state of science. But this residuum is very small. In the determination of the present state of any nation, such a large part was due to the action of circumstances that are in no way dependent on inherent tribal characteristics, that even if such peculiar qualities differing from general human nature do exist, the place left for their action is very small, immeasurably, microscopically small. We were reminded of these words when reading Labriola's views on the influence of race on the history of man's spiritual development. The author of the Essays on the Gogol Period was interested in the significance of race chiefly from the practical standpoint. But what he says should likewise be constantly borne in mind by those who are engaged in purely theoretical inquiries. Social science will gain greatly if 22. Chapter 7. We at last abandon the bad habit of attributing to race everything that seems incomprehensible in the spiritual history of a given nation. It may be that racial characteristics did have some influence on its history, But this hypothetical influence was probably so minute that it were better in the interests of the inquiry to regard it as non-existent, and to consider the peculiarities observed in the development of the given nation as the product of the special historical conditions in which that development took place, and not as a result of the influence of race. Needless to say, in quite a number of cases, we shall be unable to indicate what exactly were the conditions that gave rise to the peculiarities in which we are interested. But what does not yield to the methods of scientific investigation today may well yield to them tomorrow. As to references to racial characteristics, they are inconvenient because they terminate the investigation just at the point where it should begin. Why is the history of French poetry unlike the history of German poetry? For a very simple reason. The temperament of the French nation was such as not to permit of the rise of a Lessing, or a Schiller, or a Goethe. Well, thanks for the explanation. Now it's all perfectly clear. Labriola, of course, would have said that nothing was further from his mind than explanations of this sort, which explain nothing, and that would be true. Generally speaking, he is fully aware of their utter futility, and he also knows very well from what side a problem like the one we have instanced should be approached. But by granting that the spiritual development of nations is complicated by their racial characteristics, he ran the risk of leading his readers gravely astray and betrayed a readiness to make, even if only in minor particulars, certain concessions to the old way of thinking that are prejudicial to social science. It is against such concessions that our remarks are directed. When we say that the view we are contesting as to the influence of race on the history of ideologies is an old one, it is not without good reason. It is nothing but a variation of a theory which was very prevalent in the last century, and which endeavored to explain the whole course of history by the characteristics of human nature. This theory is absolutely incompatible with the materialist conception of history. 23. The materialist conception of history. According to the new view, the nature of social man changes as social relations change. Consequently, the general characteristics of human nature can offer no explanation of history. But although an ardent and convinced believer in the materialist conception of history, Labriola also granted, if only in a very small degree, some truth to the old view. But it is not for nothing that the Germans say, "Where es sagt, muss auch be sagen." Having granted truth to the old view in one instance, Labriola had to grant it in others too. Need it be said that this combination of two diametrically opposite views was bound to impair the harmony of his world outlook? 24. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. The organization of any given society is determined by the state of its productive forces. As this state changes, the social organization is bound sooner or later to change too. Consequently, it is in a state of unstable equilibrium wherever the social productive forces are developing. Labriola quite rightly remarks that it is this instability, together with the social movements and the struggle of social classes, to which it gives rise, that preserves man from mental stagnation. Antagonism is the principal cause of progress, he says, repeating the thought of a very well-known German economist. But right away, he makes a reservation. It would be a great mistake, in his opinion, to suppose that men always and in all cases have a proper understanding of their situation and clearly perceive the social tasks with which it confronts them. To suppose that, he says, is to suppose the improbable and indeed the unreal. We would request the reader to pay careful attention to this reservation. Labriola develops his thought as follows. Forms of law, political acts, and attempts at social organization were, and they still are, sometimes fortunate, sometimes mistaken, that is to say, disproportionate and unsuitable. History is full of errors, and this means that if all were necessary, granted the relative intelligence of those who have to solve a difficulty, or to find a solution for a given problem, if everything in it had a sufficient reason, yet everything in it is not reasonable, in the sense which the optimists give to this word. To state it more fully, The determining causes of all changes, that is to say, the modified economic conditions, have ended and end by causing to be found, sometimes through tortuous ways, the suitable forms of law, the appropriate political orders, and the more or less perfect means of social adjustment. But it must not be thought that the instinctive wisdom of the reasoning animal has been manifested, or is manifested definitely and simply, in the complete and clear understanding of all situations, and that we have left only the very simple task of following the deductive road from the economic situation to all the rest. Igno. 25. The materialist conception of history. Rents, which, in its turn, may be explained, is an important reason for the manner in which history has proceeded, and to ignorance we must add the brutishness which is never completely subdued, and all the passions, and all the injustices, and the various forms of corruption, which were and are the necessary product of a society organized in such a way that in it the domination of man over man is inevitable. From this domination falsehood, hypocrisy, presumption, and baseness were and are inseparable. We may, without being utopians, foresee, as we do in fact foresee, the coming of a society which, developing from the present society and from its very contrasts by the laws inherent in its historic development, will end in an association without class antagonisms. But that is the future, and it is neither the present nor the past. Regulated production will eliminate from life the ailment of chance, which thus far has been revealed in history as a multiform cause of accidents and incidents. Nan, there is a good deal of truth in all this, but, fantastically interwoven with error, truth itself here assumes the form of a not altogether felicitous paradox. Labriola is undoubtedly right when he says that men do not always by far have a clear understanding of their social situation, and are not always properly aware of the social tasks to which it gives rise. But when, on this basis, he talks of ignorance or superstition as being the historical cause of many forms of social life and many customs, he himself unwittingly reverts to the viewpoint of the enlighteners of the 18th century. Before speaking of ignorance as an important reason for the manner in which history has proceeded, he should have defined the precise sense in which this word may here be used. It would be a great mistake to think that this is self-evident. No, it is far from being as evident or as simple as it seems. Take France of the 18th century as an example. All intelligent representatives of the Third Estate had a burning desire for liberty and equality. In furtherance of this aim, they demanded the abolition of many antiquated social institutions, but the abolition of these institutions implied the triumph of capitalism. 26. Chapter 8, which, as we now know very well, can scarcely be called the kingdom of liberty and equality. It may therefore be said that the lofty aim of the philosophers of the last century was not attained. It may likewise be said that the philosophers were unable to indicate the means for its attainment, and they may therefore be accused of ignorance, as they actually were by many utopian socialists. Labriola himself is astonished at the contradiction between the real economic tendencies in France in those days and the ideals of its thinkers. A singular spectacle and a singular contrast, he exclaims. But what is there singular in it, and wherein lay the ignorance of the French enlighteners? Was it in the fact that their idea of the means of achieving universal happiness was not the same as ours today? But after all, there could be no question of such means in those days. They had not yet been created by man's historical movement, or more correctly, by the development of his productive forces. Read Malby's Doubts, Proposes, aux philosophes économistes. Read Morelli's Code de la Nature, and you will find that insofar as these writers differed with the great majority of the enlighteners as to the conditions of human happiness, and insofar as they dreamed of the abolition of private property, they, firstly, came into obvious and crying contradiction with the most vital and general needs of the people of their times, and, secondly, vaguely conscious of this, They themselves regarded their dreams as utterly unrealizable. And therefore, we once more ask, wherein lay the ignorance of the enlighteners? Was it in the fact that, while realizing the social needs of their times and indicating the proper means of satisfying them, abolition of the old privileges, etc., they attached an entirely exaggerated significance to these means? That is, as a way towards universal happiness? That is not such a preposterous ignorance, and, taking the practical view, it must even be admitted that it had its uses, for the more the enlighteners believed in the universal value of the reforms they demanded, the more energetically they were bound to fight for them. Undoubtedly, the enlighteners betrayed ignorance in not being able to find the thread connecting their views and aspirations with the 27. The materialist conception of history, economic condition of France at that period, and not even suspecting that such a thread existed. They looked upon themselves as exponents of absolute truth. We know today that there is no such thing as absolute truth, that everything is relative, that everything is dependent on the conditions of time and place. But precisely for that reason, we should be very cautious in judging the ignorance of various historical periods. Their ignorance, to the extent that it is manifested in their characteristic social movements, aspirations, and ideals, is also relative. 28. 9. Chapter 9 Tar. How does law arise? It may be said that all law represents the supersession or modification of an older law or custom. Why are old customs superseded? Because they cease to conform to the new conditions, that is, to the new actual relations in which men stand towards each other in the social process of production. Primitive communism disappeared owing to the development of productive forces. However, productive forces develop, but gradually. Hence, the new actual relations of man to man in the social process of production also develop, but gradually. And hence, too, the restrictiveness of the old laws or customs, and, consequently, the need to provide a corresponding legal expression of the new actual economic relations of men, also develop, but gradually. The instinctive wisdom of the reasoning animal usually follows in the wake of these actual changes. If old laws hamper a section of society in attaining its material aims, in satisfying its urgent wants, it will infallibly, and with the greatest ease, become conscious of their restrictiveness. This requires very little more intelligence than is necessary for the consciousness that tight shoes or heavy weapons are uncomfortable. But, of course, from being conscious of the restrictiveness of an existing law to consciously striving to abolish, it is a very far cry. At first, men simply try to get round it in each particular case. Let us recall what used to happen in our country in large peasant families, when, under the influence of nascent capitalism, new sources of earnings arose, which were not equal for all members of the family. The customary family code thereupon became restrictive for the lucky ones who earned more than the others. But it was not so easy for these lucky ones to make up their minds to revolt against the old custom. And they did not do so all at once. For a long time they simply resorted to subterfuge, concealing part of their earnings from the elders. But the new economic system grew gradually stronger, and the old family life more and more shaken. Those members of the family who were interested in its abolition grew bolder and bolder. Sons more and more frequently separated off from the common household, and in the end the old cuss. 29. The materialist conception of history. Tom disappeared and was replaced by a new custom, arising out of the new conditions, the new actual relations, the new economics of society. Man's cognition of his situation more or less lags as a rule behind the development of the new actual relations which cause that situation to change. But it does keep in the wake of the actual relations. Where man's conscious striving for the abolition of old institutions and the establishment of a new legal system is weak, there the way for the new system has not yet been properly paved by the economics of the society. In other words, in history, lack of clear cognition, the blunders of immature thought, ignorance, not infrequently signifies only one thing, namely that the object to be cognized, that is, the new, nascent things, is still but poorly developed, And obviously, ignorance of this kind, lack of knowledge or understanding of what does not yet exist, of what is still in process of becoming, is only relative ignorance. There's another kind of ignorance, ignorance of nature. That may be called absolute ignorance. Its criterion is nature's power over man. And as the development of productive forces signifies the increasing power of man over nature, it is clear that any increase in productive forces implies a diminution in absolute ignorance. Natural phenomena which man does not understand, and therefore cannot control, give rise to various kinds of superstition. At a certain stage of social development, superstitions become closely interwoven with man's moral and legal ideas, to which they then lend a peculiar hue. Mr. M. Kovalevsky, in his Law and Custom in the Caucasus, says, an examination of the religious beliefs and superstitions of the Ishavs leads us to conclude that, beneath the official cover of Orthodox religion, this people is still at the stage of development which Tyler has so happily called animism. This stage, as we know, is usually marked by the decided subordination of both social morality and law to religion. 82. But the fact of the matter is that, according to Tyler, primitive animism has no influence either on morals or on law. At this stage of development, there is no reciprocal relation between morality and law, or else this relation is only embryonic. The animism of the savage is almost completely exempt from that moral element which in the eyes of civilized man is 30. Chapter 9. The essence of every practical religion. Moral laws have their own special foundation, etc. Hence it would be more correct to say that religious superstitions become interwoven with moral and legal ideas only at a certain and relatively high stage of social development. We very much regret that we are unable from considerations of space to show here how this is explained by modern materialism. Nor, in the process of the struggle, called forth by the development of the new actual relations of men in the social process of production, religious views often play a very important part. Both the innovators and the conservatives invoke the aid of the gods, placing various institutions under their protection, or even claiming that they are an expression of divine will. It goes without saying that the Eumenides, whom the ancient Greeks regarded as the upholders of the mother right, did as little in its defense as Minerva did for the triumph of the power of the father, which was supposedly so dear to her heart. Men simply wasted their time and effort in calling upon the aid of gods and fetishes. But the ignorance which made belief in the Eumenides possible did not prevent the Greek conservatives of the time from realizing that the old legal system, or, more precisely, the old customary law, was a better guarantee of their interests. Similarly, the superstition that permitted the innovators to base their hopes on Minerva did not prevent them from realizing the inconvenience of the old order of life. The use of the wedge in the cutting of wood was unknown to the Dyaks of Borneo. When the Europeans introduced it, the native authorities solemnly banned its use. That evidently was a proof of their ignorance, for what could be more senseless than refusing to use a tool that helps to lighten labor? But just think a little, and you win. Perhaps grant that there may have been extenuating circumstances. The ban on the employment of European tools was probably one manifestation of the struggle against European influences, which were beginning to undermine the old aboriginal order. The native authorities had a vague apprehension that if European customs were introduced, not a single stone of that order would be left standing. For some reason, the wedge was more suggestive in their minds of the destructive power of Euro. 31. The materialist conception of history, keen influences than any other European implement, and so we find them solemnly prohibiting its use. Why precisely was it the wedge that came to be the symbol of dangerous innovations in their eyes? To that question, we may furnish a sufficient answer. We do not know why the wedge associated itself in the minds of the natives with the idea of the danger that menaced their old form of life. But we can say with certainty that the natives were perfectly right in fearing for the stability of their old order. European influences do very rapidly and very seriously impair, if not altogether destroy, the customs of the savages and barbarians who fall beneath their sway. Taylor tells us that, while the Dyaks publicly condemned the use of the wedge, they nevertheless used it when they could do so in secret. Here you have hypocrisy added to ignorance. But why? It was evidently due to a recognition of the advantages of the new method of cutting wood, accompanied, however, by a fear of public opinion or of prosecution by the authorities. Thus we find the instinctive wisdom of the reasoning animal criticizing the very measure for which it itself was responsible. And it was right in its criticism, for prohibiting the use of European tools by no means meant eliminating European influences. We might borrow Labriola's expression and say that in this instance, the Dyaks adopted a measure which was unsuitable and disproportionate to their situation. We would be perfectly right. And we might add to Labriola's remark that people very often devise measures that are disproportionate and unsuitable to their situation. But what follows? Only that we must try to discover whether some sort of dependence does not exist between this kind of mistake and the character or degree of development of man's. Social relations. Such a dependence undoubtedly does exist. Labriola says that ignorance may be explained in its turn. We say, not only can it be explained, but it should be explained, if social science is capable of becoming a strict science at all. If ignorance may be attributed to social causes, then there is no point in citing it. There is no point in saying that it explains the enigma of why history proceeded thus and not otherwise. The answer lies not there, but in the social causes that gave rise to it, and lent it one form rather than another. 132. Chapter 9. Character rather than another. Why restrict your investigation by simply talking about ignorance, which explains nothing? Where a scientific conception of history is concerned, for the investigator to talk of ignorance only testifies to his own ignorance. 33. The materialist conception of history. Chapter 10. All positive law is a defense of some definite interest. How do these interests arise? Are they a product of human will and human consciousness? No, they are created by man's economic relations. Once they have arisen, interests are reflected in one way or another in man's consciousness. In order to defend an interest, there must be consciousness of it. Hence, every system of positive law may and should be regarded as a product of consciousness. It is not man's consciousness that calls into being the interests that the law protects, and consequently, it is not man's consciousness that determines the content of law, but the state of social consciousness, social psychology. Unless we take the state of the social consciousness into account, we shall be absolutely unable to explain the history of law. In this history, it is always essential to draw a careful distinction between form and content. In its formal aspect, law, like every ideology, is subject to the influence of all, or at least of some of, the other ideologies, religious beliefs, philosophical concepts, and so on. This in itself hinders to some extent, and sometimes to a very large extent, the disclosure of the dependence between men's legal concepts and their mutual relations in the social process of production. But that is only half the trouble. The real trouble is that at different stages of social development, a given ideology is subject to the influences of other ideologies in very unequal degrees. For example, ancient Egyptian, and partly Roman, law was under the sway of religion. In more recent history, law has developed, we repeat, and request it to be noted, that we are here speaking of the formal aspect, under the strong influence of philosophy. Philosophy had to put up a big fight before it succeeded in eliminating the influence of religion on law and substituting its own influence. This fight was nothing but a reflection in the realm of ideas of the social struggle between the third estate and the clergy. But, nevertheless, it greatly hampered the formation of a correct view of the origin of legal institutions. 34. Chapter 10. For, thanks to it, these institutions seem to be the obvious and indubitable product of a struggle between abstract ideas. It goes without saying that, generally speaking, Labriola perfectly realizes what kind of actual relations are concealed behind such a conflict of concepts. But when he comes to particulars, he lays down his materialist weapons in the face of the difficulties of the problem, and considers it possible, as we have seen, to confine oneself to adducing ignorance or the power of tradition as an explanation. What is more, he speaks of symbolism as the final cause of many customs. It is true that symbolism has been a factor of no little importance in the history of certain ideologies, but as the final cause of customs, it will not do at all. Let us take an example like the following. Among the Ishavs of the Caucasus, it is the custom for a woman to cut off her braid of hair on the death of a brother, but not on the death of her husband. This is a symbolical act. It is a substitution for the older custom of self-immolation on the grave of the dead man. But why does the woman perform this symbolical act on the grave of a brother and not on the grave of her husband? Mr. Kovalevsky says that this feature can only be regarded as a survival from those remote times when the chief of the clan, which was united by its real or imaginary descent from a woman, the foremother of the clan, was the oldest descendant on the mother's side, the nearest cognate. It therefore follows that symbolical acts are comprehensible only when we understand the meaning and origin of the relations they symbolize. How do these relations arise? The answer to this question must not be sought, of course, in symbolical acts, although they may sometimes furnish useful clues. The origin of the symbolical custom by which a woman cuts off her braid on the grave of a brother is to be explained by the history of the family, and the explanation of the history of the family is to be sought in the history of economic development. In the case with which we are concerned, when the woman cuts off her braid on the grave of a brother, this right has survived the form of kinship to which it owed its origin. There you have an example of that influence of tradition of which Labriola speaks. But tradition can. 35. The materialist conception of history only preserve what already exists. It not only fails to explain the origin of the given right or of the given form in general, but even fails to explain its preservation. Force of tradition is a force of inertia. When examining the history of ideologies, we are often constrained to ask ourselves why a particular right or custom should have survived when not only the relations to which it owed its origin, but other cognate customs or rights which originated in the same relations disappeared. That is equivalent to asking why the destructive effect of the new relations spared just this particular right or custom while eliminating others. To answer this question by talking about the force of tradition is nothing more than reiterating the question in an affirmative form. How are we to get out of the difficulty? By turning to social psychology. Old customs begin to disappear and old rights to break down when men enter into new reciprocal relations. The conflict of social interests finds expression in a conflict between the new customs and rights and the old. No symbolical right or custom, taken by itself, can influence the development of the new relations either positively or negatively. If the conservatives passionately uphold the old customs, it is because in their minds the idea of an advantageous, precious, and customary social system is firmly associated with the idea of these customs. If the innovators detest and scoff at these customs, it is because in their minds the idea of these customs is associated with the idea of restrictive, disadvantageous, and objectionable social relations. Consequently, the whole point lies in an association of ideas. When we find that a particular right has survived not only the relations which gave rise to it, but also cognate rights that arose from these same relations, we have to conclude that in the minds of the innovators it was not so strongly associated with the idea of the old detested order as other customs were. Why so? To answer this question is sometimes easy, but at others it is quite impossible for lack of the necessary psychological data. But even when we are constrained to admit that the question is unanswerable, at least in the existing state of our knowledge, we must nevertheless remember that the point does not lie in the force of tradition, but in definite associations of ideas produced by definite actual relations of men in society. 36. Chapter 10. The history of ideologies is to a large extent to be explained by the rise, modification, and breakdown of associations of ideas under the influence of the rise, modification, and breakdown of definite combinations of social forces. Labriola has not given this side of the question all the attention it deserves. This is clearly shown in his view of philosophy. 37. The materialist conception of history. Chapter According to Labriola, in its historical development, philosophy partly merges with theology, and partly represents the development of human thought in relation to the objects which come within the field of our experience. Insofar as it is distinct from theology, it is occupied with the same problems as scientific investigation, in the proper sense of the term. In doing so, it either strives to anticipate science by offering its own conjectural solutions, or simply summarizes and submits to further logical elaboration the solutions already found by science. That, of course, is true, but it is not the whole truth. Take modern philosophy. Descartes and Bacon held that it was one of the most important functions of philosophy to multiply our scientific knowledge in order to increase man's power over nature. We accordingly find that in their time, philosophy was occupied with the same problems as formed the theme of the natural sciences. It might therefore be thought that the solutions it furnished were determined by the state of natural science. But that is not quite the case. Descartes' attitude to certain philosophical questions, as for example, the question of the soul, cannot be explained by the state of the natural sciences in those days. But this attitude can be well explained by the social state of France at the time. Descartes made a strict distinction between the sphere of faith and the sphere of reason. His philosophy did not contradict Catholicism. On the contrary, it endeavored to confirm some of its dogmas by new arguments. In this respect, it was a good reflection of the sentiments of Frenchmen at that period. After the prolonged and sanguinary conflicts of the 16th century, a universal desire for peace and order arose in France. In the realm of politics, this desire was expressed in a sympathy for the absolute monarchy. In the realm of thought, it was expressed in a certain religious tolerance and an anxiety to avoid all controversial questions that might recall the recent civil war. These were religious questions. So that they might be avoided, a line of demarcation had to be drawn between the realm of faith and the realm of reason. That, as we have said, was what Descartes did. But this demarcation was not. 38. Chapter 11. Enough. Social peace demanded that philosophy solemnly admit the truth of religious dogma. And through Descartes this too was done. That is why the system of this thinker, although at least three-quarters materialistic, was sympathetically greeted by many ecclesiastics. A logical sequel to the philosophy of Descartes was the materialism of La Mettrie, but idealistic conclusions might have been drawn from it just as readily. And if the French did not do so, there was a very definite social reason for it, namely the hostility of the Third Estate to the clergy of 18th century France. Whereas the philosophy of Descartes sprang from a desire for social peace, the materialism of the 18th century was the herald of new social upheavals. It will be seen from this alone that the development of philosophical thought in France is to be explained not only by the development of natural science, but also by the direct influence of developing social relations. This is revealed even more clearly when the history of French philosophy is carefully examined from another angle. Descartes, as we already know, held that the chief purpose of philosophy was to increase man's power over nature. The French materialists of the 18th century held that their prime duty was to replace certain old concepts by new ones, on which normal social relations might be erected. The French materialists made practically no mention of increasing the social forces of production. That is a highly important difference. What was it due to? The development of productive forces in France in the 18th century was being severely hampered by the antiquated social relations of production, by archaic social institutions. The abolition of these institutions was absolutely essential for the further development of the productive forces, and it was in their abolition that the whole meaning of the social movement in France of that period lay. In philosophy, the necessity for this abolition found expression in a struggle against antiquated abstract concepts which had sprung from the antiquated relations of production. In the time of Descartes, these relations were still by no means antiquated, like the social institutions which had sprung from them. 39. The materialist conception of history. They were not hindering, but facilitating the development of productive forces. Hence it never occurred to anybody to abolish them. That is why philosophy set itself the direct task of increasing productive forces, this being the prime practical task of the nascent bourgeois society. We say this in objection to Labriola, but it may be that our objection is superfluous, that he merely expressed himself inaccurately, while at bottom being in agreement with us. We should be very glad if it were so. It is pleasant to have intelligent people agree with you, and if he did not agree with us, we would regretfully repeat that this intelligent man is mistaken. In doing so, we might be furnishing our subjectivist old gentleman with an excuse for one more jibe to the effect that it is difficult to distinguish the authentic adherents of the materialist conception of history from the unauthentic. But our reply to the subjectivist old gentleman would be, they are jeering at themselves. Anybody who has properly grasped the meaning of a philosophical system can easily distinguish its true adherents from the false. If our friends the subjectivists had taken the trouble to ponder over the materialist explanation of history, they would have known themselves who are the authentic disciples, and who are the impostors that take the great name in vain. But since they have not taken that trouble and never will, they must of necessity remain in perplexity. That is the common fate of all who fall behind, and drop out of the marching army of progress. Incidentally, a word about progress. Do you recall, dear reader, the days when the metaphysicians were abused, when the textbooks of philosophy were Lewis and partly Mr. Spasovich's Manual of Criminal Law, and when, for the benefit of progressive readers, special formulas were invented, so simple that even a child of tender age might understand them? What glorious days those were! But they are gone. They have vanished like smoke. Metaphysics is again beginning to attract Russian minds. Lewis is going out of use, and the celebrated formulas of progress are being universally forgotten. Today it is very rare even for the subjectivist sociologists themselves, now grown. 40. Chapter 11. So venerable and hoary to recall these formulas. It is noteworthy, for instance, that nobody recalled them, even when there was apparently a most urgent need for them, namely when the argument was raging whether we could turn from the path of capitalism to the path of utopia. Our utopians used to hide behind the skirts of a man who, while advocating his fantastic popular industry, at the same time claimed to be an adherent of modern dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism turned into a sophistry, thus proved to be the only weapon in the hands of the utopians worthy of any attention. In view of this, it would be very useful to discuss how progress is regarded by the adherents of the materialist conception of history. To be sure, this question has been repeatedly discussed in our press. But, firstly, the modern materialist view of progress is still not clear to many. And secondly, in Labriola's book, it is illustrated by some very happy examples and explained by some very correct arguments. Although, unfortunately, FT is not expounded systematically and fully. Labriola's arguments should be supplemented. We hope to do so at a more convenient opportunity. Meanwhile, it is time to draw to a close. But before laying down our pen, we would once more request the reader to remember that what is known as economic materialism, against which the objections, and very unconvincing ones at that, of our friends the Narodniks and subjectivists are directed, has very little in common with the modern materialist conception of history. From the standpoint of the theory of factors, human society is a heavy load which various forces, morality, law, economics, etc., drag each in its own way along the path of history. From the standpoint of the modern materialist conception of history, the whole thing assumes a different aspect. It turns out that the historical factors are mere abstractions, and when the mist surrounding them is dispelled, it becomes clear that men do not make several distinct histories. The history of law, the history of morals, the history of philosophy, etc. are but only one history, the history of their own social relations, which are determined by the 41. The materialist conception of history, state of the productive forces in each particular period. What is known as the ideologies is nothing but a multiform reflection in the minds of men of this single and indivisible history. 42. The role of the individual in history. Chapter 1. In the second half of the 70s, the late Kablitz wrote an article entitled The Mind and the Senses as Factors of Progress, in which, referring to Spencer, he argued that the senses played the principal role in human progress, and that the mind played only a secondary role, and quite a subordinate one at that. A certain esteemed sociologist, one replied to Kablitz, expressing amusement and surprise at a theory which placed the mind on the footboard. The esteemed sociologist was right, of course, in defending the mind. He would have been much more right, however, had he, without going into the details of the question that Kablitz had raised, proved that his very method of presenting it was impossible and impermissible. Indeed, the factors theory is unsound in itself, for it arbitrarily picks out different sides of social life, hypostasizes them, converts them into forces of a special kind, which, from different sides, and with unequal success, draw the social man along the path of progress. But this theory is still less sound in the form presented by Kablitz, who converted into special sociological hypostases, not the various sides of the activities of the social man, but the different spheres of the individual mind. This is a veritable Herculean pillar of abstraction. Beyond this one cannot go, for beyond it lies the comic kingdom of utter and obvious absurdity. It is to this that the esteemed sociologist should have drawn the attention of Kablitz and his readers. Perhaps, after revealing the depths of abstraction into which the effort to find the predominating factor in history had led Kablitz, the esteemed sociologist might by chance, have made some contribution to the critique of this factors theory. This would have been very useful for all of us at that time, but he proved unequal to his mission. He himself subscribed to that theory, differing from Kablitz only in his leanings towards eclecticism, and consequently, all the factors seemed to him to be equally important. Subsequently, the eclectic nature of his mind found particularly striking expression in his attacks on dialectical talk. The reference is to N.K. Mikhailovsky, who responded to the publication of Kablitz's article in his literary notes for 1878. 45. The role of the individual in history. Materialism, which he regarded as a doctrine which sacrifices all other factors to the economic factor, and reduces the role of the individual in history to nothing. It never occurred to the esteemed sociologist that the factor's point of view is alien to dialectical materialism, and that only one who is utterly incapable of thinking logically can see in it any justification of so-called quietism. Incidentally, it must be observed that the slip made by our esteemed sociologist is not unique. Very many others have made it, are making it, and probably will go on making it. Materialists began to be accused of betraying leanings towards quietism even before they had worked out their dialectical conception of nature and of history. Without making an excursion into the depth of time, we will recall the controversy between the celebrated English scientist Priestley and Price. Analyzing Priestley's theories, Price argued that materialism was incompatible with the concept free will, and that it precluded all independent activity on the part of the individual. In reply, Priestley referred to everyday experience. He would not speak of himself, he said, though by no means the most apathetic of creatures. But where would one find more mental vigor, more activity, more force and persistence in the pursuit of extremely important aims than among those who subscribe to the doctrine of necessity? Priestley had in view the religious, democratic sect then known as Christian Necessarians. 2. 3. We do not know whether this sect was as active as Priestley, who belonged to it, thought it was, but that is not important. There cannot be the slightest doubt that the materialist conception of the human will is quite compatible with the most vigorous practical activity. Lanson observes that all the doctrines which called for the utmost exertion of human will asserted, in principle, that the will was impotent. They rejected free will and subjected the world to fatalism. For Lanson was wrong in thinking that every repudiation of what is called free will, too. A Frenchman of the 17th century would have been surprised at this combination of materialism and religious dogma. In England, however, nobody thought it strange. Priestley himself was very religious. Different countries, different customs. 3. Christian Necessarians, a Christian sect which maintained that the will is not free, and that moral creatures do not act freely but according to necessity. 4. Cf. at His Histoire de la littérature française, Vol. I. 46, Chapter 1, leads to fatalism. But this did not prevent him from noting an extremely interesting historical fact. Indeed, history shows that even fatalism was not always a hindrance to energetic, practical action. On the contrary, in certain epochs, it was a psychologically necessary basis for such action. In proof of this, we will point to the Puritans, who in energy excelled all the other parties in England in the 17th century, and to the followers of Muhammad, who in a short space of time subjugated an enormous part of the globe, stretching from India to Spain. Those who think that as soon as we are convinced of the inevitability of a certain series of events, we lose all psychological possibility to help bring on, or to counteract, these events, are very much mistaken. 5. Here, everything depends upon whether my activities constitute an inevitable link in the chain of inevitable events. If they do, then I waver less, and the more resolute are my actions. There is nothing surprising in this. When we say that a certain individual regards his activities as an inevitable link in the chain of inevitable events, we mean, among other things, that for this individual, lack of free will is tantamount to incapability of inaction, and that this lack of free will is reflected in his mind as the impossibility of acting differently from the way he is acting. This is precisely the psychological mood that can be expressed in the celebrated words of Luther. Here I stand, I can do no other, and thanks to which men display the most indomitable energy, perform the most astonishing feats. Hamlet never knew this mood. That is why he was only capable of moaning and reflecting, and that is why Hamlet would never have accepted a philosophy, according to which freedom is merely necessity transformed into mind. Fichte rightly said, as the man is, so is his philosophy. 5. It is well known that, according to the doctrines of Calvin, all men's actions are predetermined by God. By predestination we mean the eternal decree of God by which he within himself has ordained what it behoves shall happen to each man. Institutio, Book 3, Ch. 5. According to the same doctrine, God chooses certain of his servants to liberate unjustly oppressed peoples. Such a one was Moses, who liberated the people of Israel. Everything goes to show that Cromwell also regarded himself as such an instrument of God. He always called his actions the fruits of the will of God, and probably he was quite sincerely convinced that they were so. For him, all these actions were colored by necessity beforehand. This did not prevent him from striving for victory after victory. It even gave this striving indomitable power. 47. The role of the individual in history. Chapter 2. Some people here have taken seriously Stamler's remarks about the allegedly insoluble contradiction that is said to be characteristic of a certain West European social political theory. 6. We have in mind the well-known example of the eclipse of the moon. As a matter of fact, this is a supremely absurd example. The combination of conditions that are necessary to cause an eclipse of the moon does not, and cannot under any circumstances, include human action, and, for this reason alone, projects to assist the eclipse of the moon can arise only in a lunatic asylum. But, even if human action did serve as one of these conditions, none of those who keenly desired to see an eclipse of the moon would, if they were convinced that it would certainly take place without their aid, join the eclipse of the moon party. In this case, quietism would merely be abstention from unnecessary, i.e., useless, action, and would have no affinity with real quietism. In order that the example of the eclipse of the moon may cease to be nonsensical in the case of the above-mentioned party that we are examining, it must be entirely changed. It would have to be imagined that the moon is gifted with a mind, and that her position in celestial space, which causes her eclipse, appears to her to be the fruit of the self-determination of her own will, that it not only gives her enormous pleasure, but is absolutely necessary for her peace of mind, and that this is why she always passionately strives to occupy this position. 7. After imagining all this, the question would have to be asked, what would the moon feel if she discovered at last that it is not her will and not her ideals that determine her movement in celestial space, but, on the contrary, that her movement determines her will and her idols? According to Stamler, such a discovery would certainly make her incapable of moving, unless she succeeded in extricating herself from her predicament by some logical contradiction. But 6. IEA, Marxism, trans. 7. Tentatio. It is as if the compass needle took pleasure in turning towards the north, believing that its movement was independent of any other cause, and unaware of the imperceptible movements of magnetic matter. Leibniz, Theodicee, Lausanne, 1760, p. 598. 48. Chapter 2. Such an assumption is totally groundless. This discovery might serve as a formal reason for the moon's bad temper, for feeling out of harmony with herself, for the contradiction between her ideals and mechanical reality. But since we are assuming that the moon's psychological state in general is, in the last analysis, determined by her movement, then the cause of her disturbed peace of mind must be sought for in her movement. If this subject were examined carefully, it would have transpired, perhaps, that when the moon was at her apogee, she grieved over the fact that her will was not free. And when she was at her perigee, this very circumstance served as a new, formal cause of her happiness and good spirits. Perhaps the opposite would have happened. Perhaps it would have transpired that she found the means of reconciling free will with necessity, not at her perigee, but at her apogee. Be that as it may, such a reconciliation is undoubtedly possible. Being conscious of necessity is quite compatible with the most energetic practical action. At all events, this has been the case in history so far. Men who have repudiated free will have often excelled all their contemporaries in strength of will, and asserted their will to the utmost. Numerous examples of this can be quoted. They are universally known. They can be forgotten, as Stamler evidently does, only if one deliberately refuses to see historical reality as it actually is. This attitude is strongly marked among our subjectivist Sate, for example, and among some German Philistines. Philistines and subjectivists, however, are not men but mere phantoms, as Belinsky would have said. Let us, however, examine more closely the case when a man's own past, present, or future actions seem to him to be entirely colored by necessity. We know already that such a man, regarding himself as a messenger of God, like Muhammad, as one chosen by an ineluctable destiny, like Napoleon, or as the expression of the irresistible force of historical progress, like some of the public men in the 19th. 8. Subjectivists, adherents of the subjective method in sociology, who denied the objective nature of the laws of social development and reduced history to the activities of individual heroes, outstanding personalities. In the second half of the 19th century, the subjective method in sociology was represented in Russia by the liberal Narodniks, N.K.A. Mikhailovsky among them. 49. The role of the individual in history. Century displays almost elemental strength of will and sweeps from his path like a house of cards all the obstacles set up by the small-town hamlets and hamletkins. 910. But this case interests us now from another angle, namely, as follows. When the consciousness of my lack of free will presents itself to me only in the form of the complete subjective and objective impossibility of acting differently from the way I am acting, and when, at the same time, my actions are to me the most desirable of all other possible actions, then, in my mind, necessity becomes identified with freedom, and freedom with necessity, and then I am unfree only in the sense that I cannot disturb this identity between freedom and necessity. I cannot oppose one to the other. I cannot feel the restraint of necessity. But such a lack of freedom is at the same time its fullest manifestation. Simmel says that freedom is always freedom from something, and where freedom is not conceived as the opposite of restraint, it is meaningless. That is so, of course. But this slight elementary truth cannot serve as a ground for refuting the thesis, which constitutes one of the most brilliant discoveries ever made by philosophic thought, that freedom means being conscious of necessity. Simmel's definition is too narrow. It applies only to freedom from external restraint. As long as we are discussing only such restraints, it would be extremely ridiculous to identify freedom with necessity. A pickpocket is not free to steal your pocket handkerchief while you are preventing him from doing so, and until he has overcome you, our resistance in one way or another. In addition to this elementary and superficial conception of freedom, however, there is another, incomparably more profound. For those who are incapable of thinking philosophically, this concept does not exist at all, and those who are capable of thinking philosophically grasp it only when 9. We will quote another example, which vividly illustrates how strongly people of this category feel. In a letter to her teacher, Calvin Renée, Duchess of Ferrara, of the house of Louis XII, wrote as follows. No, I have not forgotten what you wrote to me, that David bore mortal hatred towards the enemies of God. And I will never act differently, for if I knew that the king, my father, the queen, my mother, the late lord, my husband, feu Monsieur Montmarie, and all my children had been cast out by God, I would hate them with a mortal hatred, and would wish them in hell, etc. What terrible, all-destroying energy the people who felt like this could display. And yet these people denied that there was such a thing as free will. 10. Plekhanov is referring to I.S. Turgenev's story Hamlet of Shigrov Uyezd. 50. Chapter 2. They have cast off dualism and realize that, contrary to the assumption of the dualists, there is no gulf between the subject and the object. The Russian subjectivist opposes his utopian ideals to our capitalist reality and goes no further. The subjectivists have stuck in the bog of dualism. The ideals of the so-called Russian disciples 11 resemble capitalist reality far less than the ideals of the subjectivists. Notwithstanding this, however, the disciples have found a bridge which unites ideals with reality. The disciples have elevated themselves to monism. In their opinion, capitalism, in the course of its development, will lead to its own negation and to the realization of the Russian disciples, and not only the Russian ideals. This is historical necessity. The disciple serves as an instrument of this necessity and cannot help doing so, owing to his social status and to his mentality and temperament, which were created by his status. This, too, is an aspect of necessity. Since his social status has imbued him with this character and no other, he not only serves as an instrument of necessity and cannot help doing so, but he passionately desires, and cannot help desiring, to do so. This is an aspect of freedom, and moreover, a freedom that has grown out of necessity. I.e., to put it more correctly, it is freedom that is identical with necessity. It is necessity transformed into freedom. 12. This freedom is also freedom from a certain amount of restraint. It is also the antithesis of a certain amount of restriction. Profound definitions do not refute superficial ones, but, supplementing them, include them in themselves. What sort of restraint? What sort of restriction is in question in this case? This is clear. The moral restraint which curbs the energy of those who have not cast off dualism. The restrictions suffered by those who are unable to bridge the gulf between ideals and reality. Until the individual has won this freedom by heroic effort and philosophical thinking, he does not fully belong to himself, and his mental tortures are the shameful tribute he pays to external necessity that stands opposed to him. But as soon as this individual throws off the yoke of this painful and shameful 11 issue, i.e., the Marxists, 12, necessity becomes freedom, not by disappearing, but only by the external expression of their inner identity. Hegel, Wissenschaft der Logik, Nürnberg, 1816, Zweites Buch, S. 281, 51. The role of the individual in history. Restriction, he is born for a new, full, and hitherto never experienced life, and his free actions become the conscious and free expression of necessity. 13. Then he will become a great social force, and then nothing can, and nothing will, prevent him from bursting on cunning falsehood, like a storm of wrath divine. 13. As the same old Hegel put it splendidly elsewhere, freedom is nothing more than the assertion of self. Philosophie der Religion in Werke BD. 12. p. 198. 52. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. Again, being conscious of the absolute inevitability of a given phenomenon can only increase the energy of a man who sympathizes with it, and who regards himself as one of the forces which called it into being. If such a man, conscious of the inevitability of this phenomenon, folded his arms and did nothing, he would show that he was ignorant of arithmetic. Indeed, let us suppose that phenomenon must necessarily take place under a given sum of circumstances. As you have proved to me that a part of this sum of circumstances already exists, and that the other part will exist in a given time t. Being convinced of this, I, the man who sympathizes with phenomenon A, exclaim, "Good," and then go to sleep until the happy day when the event you have foretold takes place. What will be the result? The following. In your calculations, the sum of circumstances necessary to bring about phenomenon A included my activities equal, let us say, to A. As, however, I am immersed in deep slumber, the sum of circumstances favorable for the given phenomenon at time T will be not S, but say, which changes the situation. Perhaps my place will be taken by another man who is also on the point of inaction, but was saved by the sight of my apathy, which to him appeared to be pernicious. In that case, force A will be replaced by force B. And if A equals B, a sum of circumstances favorable for A will remain equal to S. And phenomenon A will take place, after all, at time T. But if my force cannot be regarded as being equal to 0, if I am a skillful and capable worker, and nobody has replaced me, then we will not have the full sum S. And phenomena will take place later than we assume, or not as fully as we expected, or it may not take place at all. This is as clear as daylight, and if I do not understand it, if I think that remains even after I am replaced, it is only because I am unable to count. But am I the only one who is unable to count? You, who prophesied that the sum S would certainly be available at time T, did not foresee that I would go to sleep immediately after my conversation with you. You were convinced that I would remain a good worker too. 53. The role of the individual in history. The end. The force was less reliable than you thought. Hence, you too counted badly. But let us suppose that you had made no mistake, that you had made allowance for everything. In that case, your calculations will assume the following form. You say that a time to the sum S will be available. This sum of circumstances will include my replacement as a negative magnitude, and it will also include, as a positive magnitude, the stimulating effect on strong-minded men of the conviction that their strivings and ideals are the subjective expression of objective necessity. In that case, the sums will indeed be available at the time you appointed, and phenomenon A will take place. I think this is clear, but if this is clear, why was I confused by the idea that phenomenon A was inevitable? Why did it seem to me that it condemned me to inaction? Why, in discussing it, did I forget the simplest rules of arithmetic? Probably because, owing to the circumstances of my upbringing, I already had a very strong leaning toward inaction, and my conversation with you served as the drop which filled the cup of this laudable inclination to overflowing. That is all. Only in this sense, as the cause that revealed my moral flabbiness and uselessness, did the consciousness of necessity figure here. It cannot possibly be regarded as the cause of this flabbiness. The causes of it are the circumstances of my upbringing. And so, arithmetic is a very respectable and useful science, the rules of which should not be forgotten even by, I would say, particularly philosophers. But what effect will the consciousness of the necessity of a given phenomenon have upon a strong man who does not sympathize with it and resists its taking place? Here the situation is somewhat different. It is very possible that it will cause the vigor of his resistance to relax. But when do the opponents of a given phenomenon become convinced that it is inevitable? When the circumstances favorable to it are very numerous and very strong. The fact that its opponents realize that the phenomenon is inevitable and the relaxation of their energy are merely manifestations of the force of circumstances favorable to it. These manifestations, in their turn, are a part of the favorable circumstances, but the vigor of resistance will not be relaxed among all the oppo. 54. Chapter 3. Hence, among some of them the consciousness that the phenomenon is inevitable will cause it to grow and become transformed into the vigor of despair. History in general, and the history of Russia in particular, provides not a few instructive examples of this sort of vigor. We hope the reader will be able to recall these without our assistance. Here we are interrupted by Mr. Karayev, who, while of course disagreeing with our views on freedom and necessity, and moreover disapproving of our partiality for the extremes to which strong men go, nevertheless, is pleased to meet in the pages of our journal the idea that the individual may be a great social force. The worthy Professor Joy fully exclaims, "I have always said that, and this is true. Mr. Karayev and all the subjectivists have always ascribed a very important role to the individual in history, and there was a time when they enjoyed considerable sympathy among advanced young people who were imbued with noble strivings to work for the common weal, and were therefore naturally inclined to attach great importance to individual issues. In essence, however, the subjectivists have never been able to solve, or even to present properly, the problem of the role of the individual in history. As against the influence of the laws of social historical progress, they advanced the activities of critically thinking individuals, and thus created, as it were, a new species of the factors theory. Critically thinking individuals were one factor of this progress. Its own laws were the other factor. This resulted in an extreme incongruity, which one could put up with as long as the attention of the active individuals was concentrated on the practical problems of the day, and they had no time to devote to philosophical problems. But the calm which ensued in the 80s gave those who were capable of thinking enforced leisure for philosophical reflection, and since then, the subjectivist doctrine has been bursting at all its seams, and even falling to pieces, like the celebrated overcoat of Akasevich Vatsyl. No amount of patching was of any use, and one after another, thinking people began to reject subjectivism as an obviously and utterly unsound doctrine. As always happens in such cases, however, the reaction against this doctrine caused some 14. Akasi, a character in Gogol's story. A greatcoat. 55. The role of the individual in history. Of its opponents to go to the opposite extreme. While some subjectivists, striving to ascribe the widest possible role to the individual in history, refuse to recognize the historical progress of mankind as a process expressing laws, some of their later opponents, striving to bring out more sharply the coherent character of this progress, were evidently prepared to forget that men make history, and therefore the activities of individuals cannot help being important in history. They have declared the individual to be a quantité negligible. In theory, this extreme is as impermissible as the one reached by the more ardent subjectivists. It is as unsound to sacrifice the thesis to the antithesis as to forget the antithesis for the sake of the thesis. The correct point of view will be found only when we succeed in uniting the points of truth contained in them into a synthesis. 15. In our striving for a synthesis, we were forestalled by the same Mr. Karayev. Unfortunately, however, he went no farther than to admit the truism that man consists of a soul and a body. 56. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. This problem has been interesting us for a long time, and we have long wanted to invite our readers to join us in tackling it. We were restrained, however, by certain fears. We thought that perhaps our readers had already solved it for themselves, and that our proposal would be belated. These fears have now been dispelled. The German historians have dispelled them for us. We are quite serious in saying this. The fact of the matter is that lately, a rather heated controversy has been going on among the German historians over great men in history. Some have been inclined to regard the political activities of these men as the main and almost the only spring of historical development, while others have been asserting that such a view is one-sided and that the science of history must have in view not only the activities of great men, and not only political history, but historical life as a whole, das ganze des geschichtlichen Lebens. One of the representatives of the latter trend is Karl Lamprecht, author of The History of the German People, translated into Russian by P. Nikolaev. Lamprecht's opponents accused him of being a collectivist and a materialist. He was even placed on a par with Horrible Dictu, the social democratic atheists, as he expressed it in winding up the debate. When we became acquainted with his views, we found that the accusations hurled against this poor savant were utterly groundless. At the same time, we were convinced that the present-day German historians were incapable of solving the problem of the role of the individual in history. We then decided that we had a right to assume that the problem was still unsolved, even for a number of Russian readers, and that something could still be said about it that would not be altogether lacking in theoretical and practical interest. Lamprecht gathered a whole collection, eine artige Sammlung, as he expresses it, of the views of prominent statesmen on their own activities in the historical milieu in which they pursued them. In his polemics, however, he confined himself for the time being to references to some of the speeches and opinions of Bismarck. He quoted the following words, uttered by the Iron Chancellor in the North German. 57. The role of the individual in history. Reichstag on April 16, 1869. Gentlemen, we can neither ignore the history of the past nor create the future. I would like to warn you against the mistake that causes people to advance the hands of their clocks, thinking that thereby they are hastening the passage of time. My influence on the events I took advantage of is usually exaggerated, but it would never occur to anyone to demand that I should make history. I could not do that even in conjunction with you, although together we could resist the whole world. We cannot make history. We must wait while it is being made. We will not make fruit ripen more quickly by subjecting it to the heat of a lamp, and if we pluck the fruit before it is ripe, we will only prevent its growth and spoil it. Referring to the evidence of July. Lamprecht also quotes the opinions which Bismarck expressed more than once during the Franco-Prussian War. 16. Again, the idea that runs through these opinions is that we cannot make great historical events, but must adapt ourselves to the natural course of things and limit ourselves to securing what is already ripe. Lamprecht regards this as the profound and whole truth. In his opinion, a modern historian cannot think otherwise, provided he is able to peer into the depths of events and not restrict his field of vision to too short an interval of time. Could Bismarck have caused Germany to revert to natural economy? He would have been unable to do this even when he was at the height of his power. General historical circumstances are stronger than the strongest individuals. For a great man, the general character of his epoch is empirically given necessity. This is how Lamprecht reasons, calling his view a universal one. It is not difficult to see the weak side of this universal view. The above quoted opinions of Bismarck are very interesting as a psychological document. One may not sympathize with the activities of the late German Chancellor, but one cannot say that they were insignificant, that Bismarck was distinguished for quietism. It was about him that La Salle said, "The servants of reaction are no orators, but God grant that progress has servants like them." And yet this man, who at times 16. France was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. 58. Chapter 4. Played truly iron energy. Considered himself absolutely impotent in face of the natural course of things, evidently regarding himself as a simple instrument of historical development. This proves once again that one can see phenomena in the light of necessity and at the same time be a very energetic statesman. But it is only in this respect that Bismarck's opinions are interesting. They cannot be regarded as a solution of the problem of the role of the individual in history. According to Bismarck, events occur of themselves, and we can secure what they prepare for us. But every act of securing is also an historical event. What is the difference between such events and those that occur of themselves? Actually, nearly every historical event is simultaneously an act of securing, by somebody, of the already ripened fruit of preceding development, and a link in the chain of events which are preparing the fruits of the future. How can acts of securing be opposed to the natural course of things? Evidently, Bismarck wanted to say that individuals and groups of individuals operating in history never were and never will be all-powerful. This, of course, is beyond all doubt. Nevertheless, we would like to know what their power, far from omnipotence, of course, depends on. Under what circumstances it grows and under what circumstances it diminishes. Neither Bismarck nor the learned advocate of the universal conception of history who quotes him answers these questions. It is true that Lamprecht gives us more reasonable quotations. For example, he quotes the following words of Monod. one of the most prominent representatives of contemporary historical science in France. Historians are too much in the habit of paying attention only to the brilliant, clamorous, and ephemeral manifestations of human activity, to great events and great men, instead of depicting the great and slow changes of economic conditions and social institutions, which constitute the really interesting and intransient part of human development, the part which, to a certain extent, may be reduced to laws and subjected, to a certain extent, to exact analysis. Indeed, important events and individuals are important, precisely as signs and symbols of mind. 17. Leaving aside Lamprecht's other philosophical and historical essays, we refer to his essay, Der Ausgang des geschichtswissenschaftlichen Kampfes, Die Zukunft 1897 Nobel 41. 59. The role of the individual in history. Different moments of the aforesaid development. But most of the events that are called historical have the same relation to real history as the waves which rise up from the surface of the sea, gleam in the light for a moment and break on the sandy shore, leaving no trace behind them, have to the deep and constant motion of the tides. No, sir. Lamprecht declares that he is prepared to put his signature to every one of these words. It is well known that German savants are reluctant to agree with French savants, and the French are reluctant to agree with the German. That is why the Belgian historian Pirenne was particularly pleased to emphasize in Revue Historique the fact that Monod's conception of history coincides with that of Lamprecht. This harmony is extremely significant, he observed. Evidently, it shows that the future belongs to the new conception of history. 60. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. We do not share Pirenne's pleasant expectations. The future cannot belong to vague and indefinite views, and such precisely are the views of Monod, and particularly of Lamprecht. Of course, one cannot but welcome a trend that declares that the most important task of the science of history is to study social institutions and economic conditions. This science will make great progress when such a trend becomes definitely consolidated. In the first place, however, Pirenne is wrong in thinking that this is a new trend. It arose in the science of history as far back as the 20s of the 19th century. Guizot, Mignet, Augustin Thierry, and subsequently Tocqueville and others were its brilliant and consistent representatives. The views of Monod and Lamprecht are but a faint copy of an old but excellent original. Secondly, profound as the views of Guizot, Mignet, and the other French historians may have been for their time, much in them has remained unelucidated. They do not provide a full and definite solution of the problem of the role of the individual in history, and the science of history must provide this solution if its representatives are destined to rid themselves of their one-sided conception of their subject. The future belongs to the school that finds the best solution of this problem, among others. The views of Guizot, Mignet, and the other historians who belonged to this trend were a reaction against the views on history that prevailed in the 18th century and constituted their antithesis. In the 18th century, the students of the philosophy of history reduced everything to the conscious activities of individuals. True, there were exceptions to the rule even at that time. The philosophical historical field of vision of Vico, Montesquieu, and Herder, for example, was much wider. But we are not speaking of exceptions. The great majority of the thinkers of the 18th century regarded history exactly in the way we have described. In this connection, it is very interesting to peruse once again the historical works of Mabley. For example, according to Mabley, Minos created the whole of the social and political life, and Aeathis of the Cretes, while Lycurgus performed the same service for Sparta. 61. The role of the individual in history. If the Spartans spurned material wealth, it was due entirely to Lycurgus, who descended, so to speak, into the depths of the hearts of his fellow citizens and there crushed the germ of love for wealth, descended pour ainsi dire jusqu'à le fond du cœur des citoyens, etc. 18. And if, subsequently, the Spartans strayed from the path the wise Lycurgus had pointed out to them, the blame for this rests on Lysander, who persuaded them that new times and new conditions called for new rules. and a new policy. 19 researches written from the point of view of such conceptions have very little affinity with science, and were written as sermons solely for the sake of the moral lessons that could be drawn from them. It was against such conceptions that the French historians of the period of the Restoration revolted. After the stupendous events of the end of the 18th century, it was absolutely impossible to think any longer that history was made by more or less prominent and more or less noble and enlightened individuals, who at their own discretion imbued the unenlightened but obedient masses with certain sentiments and ideas. Moreover, this philosophy of history offended the plebeian pride of the bourgeois theoreticians. They were prompted by the same feelings that revealed themselves in the 18th century in the rise of bourgeois drama. In combating the old conceptions of history, Thiers used the same arguments that were advanced by Beaumarchais and others against the old aesthetics. 20. Lastly, the storms which France had just experienced very clearly revealed that the course of historical events was by no means determined solely by the conscious actions of men. This circumstance alone was enough to suggest the idea that these events were due to the influence of some hidden necessity, operating blindly, like the elemental forces of nature, but in accordance with certain immutable laws. It is an extremely remarkable fact, which nobody, as far as we know, has pointed to before, that the French historians of the period of the Restoration applied the new conception of history. 18. Œuvres complètes de l'Abbé de Mably, London, 1783. Volume 1, pp. 3, 14, 22, 24. Atu 192. 19th House. Ibid. p. 101. 20. Compare his first letter on l'histoire de France with l'essai sur le genre dramatique sérieux in the first volume of Œuvres complètes de Beaumarchais. 62. Chapter 5. As a process conforming to laws most consistently in their works on the French Revolution. This was the case, for example, in the works of Mignet. Chateaubriand called the new school of history fatalistic. Formulating the tasks which it set the investigator, he said, "This system demands that the historian shall describe without indignation the most brutal atrocities, speak without love about the highest virtues, and with his glacial eye see in social life only the manifestation of irresistible laws, due to which every phenomenon occurs exactly as it inevitably had to occur." 21. This is wrong, of course. The new school did not demand that the historian should be impassive. Augustin Thierry even said quite openly that political passion, by sharpening the mind of the investigator, may serve as a powerful means of discovering the truth. 22. It is sufficient to make oneself only slightly familiar with the historical works of Guizot, Thierry, or Mignet, to see that they strongly sympathized with the bourgeoisie in its struggle against the lords, temporal and spiritual, as well as with its efforts to suppress the demands of the rising proletariat. What is incontrovertible is the following. The new school of history arose in the 20s of the 19th century, i.e., when the bourgeoisie had already vanquished the aristocracy, although the latter was still striving to restore some of its old privileges. The proud consciousness of the victory of their class was reflected in all the arguments of the historians of the new school. And as the bourgeoisie was never distinguished for knightly chivalry, one can sometimes discern a note of harshness to the vanquished in the arguments of its scientific representatives. Les plus forts absorbent les plus faibles, says Guizot in one of his polemical pamphlets. Et il est de droit, the strongest absorbs the weakest, and he has a right to do so. His attitude towards the working class is no less harsh. It was this harshness, which at times assumed the form of calm detachment, that misled Chateaubriand. Moreover, at that time it was not yet quite clear what was meant when it was said that history conformed to Toine Taris, Œuvres complètes de Chateaubriand, Paris, 1804, Vos auteurs d'Azemt, p. 58. We also recommend the next page to the reader. One might think that it was written by Mr. N. Michalewski. 22. Cf. Considerations sur l'histoire de France. Appendix to Receipts des temps mérovingiens. Paris, 1840. p. 72. 63. The role of the individual in history. Certain laws. Lastly, the new school may have appeared to be fatalistic because, striving firmly to adopt this point of view, it paid little attention to the great individuals in history. 23. Those who had been brought up on the historical ideas of the 18th century found it difficult to accept this. Objections to the views of the new historians poured in from all sides, and then the controversy flared up which, as we have seen, has not ended to this day. In January 1826, Sainte-Beuve, in a review in the Globe 24 of the 5th and 6th volume of Magnet's History of the French Revolution, wrote as follows. And he given on introduce into the course of events a new, unexpected, and changeable force, which may alter that course, but which cannot be measured itself owing to its changeability. It must not be thought that Sainte-Beuve assumed that sudden decisions of human will occur without cause. No, that would have been too naive. He merely asserted that the mental and moral qualities of a man who is playing a more or less important role in public life, his talent, knowledge, resoluteness or irresoluteness, courage or cowardice, etc., cannot help having a marked influence on the course and outcome of events. And yet these qualities cannot be explained solely by the general laws of development of a nation. They are always, and to a considerable degree, acquired as a result of the action of what may be called the accidents of private life. We will quote a few examples to explain this idea, which, incidentally, seems to me clear enough as it is. During the War of the Austrian Succession 25. 23. In a review of the 3rd edition of Magnet's History of the French Revolution, Sainte-Beuve characterized that historian's attitude towards great men as follows: in face of the vast and profound popular emotions which he had to describe, and of the impotence and nullity to which the sublimest genius and the saintliest virtue are reduced when the masses arise, he was seized with pity for men as individuals could see in them, taken in isolation, only their weakness, and would not allow them to be capable of effective action except through union with the multitude. 24. Le Globe, a magazine founded in Paris in 1824. It ceased publication in 1832. 25. The War of the Austrian Succession, 1740-48, was waged by Austria, supported by Britain, Holland, and Russia, against Prussia, Spain, France, and some German and Italian states. After the death of Emperor Karl VI, Austria's opponents claimed part of her territories. The war led to Austria losing most of industrial Silesia, which was annexed by Prussia, and several territories in Italy. 64. Chapter 5. The French army achieved several brilliant victories, and it seemed that France was in a position to compel Austria to cede fairly extensive territory in what is now Belgium. But Louis XV did not claim this territory because, as he said, he was fighting as a king and not as a merchant, and France got nothing out of the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle d'Auty-6. If, however, Louis XV had been a man of a different character, the territory of France would have been enlarged, and as a result, her economic and political development would have taken a somewhat different course. As is well known, France waged the 7 Years' War 27 in alliance with Austria. It is said that this alliance was concluded as a result of the strong pressure of Madame Pompadour, who had been extremely flattered by the fact that, in a letter to her, proud Maria Theresa called her cousin or dear friend, bien bonne amie. Hence, one can say that had Louis XV been a man of stricter morals, Or had he submitted less to his favorite's influence, Madame Pompadour would not have been able to influence the course of events to the extent that she did, and they would have taken a different turn. Further, France was unsuccessful in the 7 Years' War. Her generals suffered several very shameful defeats. Speaking generally, their conduct was very strange, to say the least. Richelieu engaged in plunder, and Soubise and Broglie were constantly hindering each other. For example, when Broglie was attacking the enemy at Villinghausen, Soubise heard the gunfire, but did not go to his comrade's assistance, as had been arranged, and as he undoubtedly should have done, and Broglie was obliged to retreat. 28. The extremely incompetent Soubise enjoyed the protection of the aforesaid Madame Pompadour. We can. 26. According to the terms of the peace treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, France had to cede all of the territories annexed by her in the Netherlands. 27. The 7 Years' War, 1756-63, was fought between two groups of states, one including Prussia, Britain, and Portugal, and the other, France, Austria, Russia, Saxony, and Sweden. The main causes of the war were Austria's attempts to regain Silesia, which she had lost in the War of the Austrian Succession, as well as Anglo-French rivalry over colonies in Canada and India. The war gave Britain Canada and India. 28. Incidentally, others say that Broglie was to blame for not waiting for his comrade, as he did not want to share the laurels of victory with him. This makes no difference to us, as it does not alter the case in the least. 65. The role of the individual in history. Say again that had Louis XV been less lascivious, or had his favorite refrained from interfering in politics, events would not have turned out so unfavorably for France. French historians say that there was no need at all for France to wage war on the European continent, and that she should have concentrated all her efforts on the sea in order to resist England's encroachments on her colonies. The fact that she acted differently was again due to the inevitable Madame Pompadour, who wanted to please her dear friend, Maria Theresa. As a result of the 7 Years' War, France lost her best colonies, which undoubtedly greatly influenced the development of her economic relations. In this case, feminine vanity appears in the role of the influential factor of economic development. Do we need any other examples? We will quote one more, perhaps the most astonishing one. During the aforesaid 7 Years' War, in August 1761, the Austrian troops, having united with the Russian troops in Silesia, surrounded Frederick near Striga. Frederick's position was desperate, but the Allies were tardy in attacking, and General Buterlin, after facing the enemy for 20 days, withdrew his troops from Silesia, leaving only a part of his forces as reinforcements for the Austrian General Laudon. Laudon captured Schweidnitz, near which Frederick was encamped, but this victory was of little importance. Suppose, however, Buterlin had been a man of firmer character. Suppose the Allies had attacked Frederick before he had time to entrench himself. They might have routed him, and he would have been compelled to yield to all the victor's demands. And this occurred barely a few months before a new accidental circumstance. The death of Empress Elizabeth immediately changed the situation greatly in Frederick's favor. 29. We would like to ask, what would have happened had Buterlin been a man of more resolute character, or had a man like Suvorov been in his place? In examining the views of the fatalist historians, Sainte-Beuve gave expression to another opinion, which is also worthy of attention, in the aforementioned review of Mignot's History of the French Revolution. 29. The accession of Peter III of Russia. When refused to continue the war against Prussia, facilitated Prussia. 66. Chapter 5. He argued that the course and outcome of the French Revolution were determined not only by the general causes which had given rise to the revolution, and not only by the passions which in its turn the revolution had roused, but also by numerous minor phenomena which had escaped the attention of the investigator and which were not even a part of social phenomena, properly so called. He wrote, "While these passions aroused by social phenomena were operating, the physical and physiological forces of nature were not inactive. Stones continued to obey the law of gravity. The blood did not cease to circulate in the veins. Would not the course of events have changed had Mirabeau, say, not died of fever, had Robespierre been killed by the accidental fall of a brick, or by a stroke of apoplexy, or if Bonaparte had been struck down by a bullet? And will you dare to assert that the outcome would have been the same? Given a sufficient number of accidents, similar to those I have assumed, the outcome might have been the very opposite of what, in your opinion, was inevitable. I have a right to assume the possibility of such accidents, because they are precluded neither by the general causes of the revolution, nor by the passions roused by these general causes." No. Then he goes on to quote the well-known observation that his Tory would have taken an entirely different course had Cleopatra's nose been somewhat shorter. And in conclusion, admitting that very much more could be said in defense of Mignot's view, he again shows where this author goes wrong. Mignot ascribes solely to the action of general causes results which many other minor, dark, and elusive causes had helped to bring about. His stern logic, as it were, refuses to recognize the existence of anything that seems to him to be lacking in order and law. 67. The role of the individual in history. Chapter 6. Are Saint Bu's objections sound? I think they contain a certain amount of truth. But what amount? To determine this, we will first examine the idea that a man can, by the sudden decision of his will, introduce a new force into the course of events which is capable of changing their course considerably. We have quoted a number of examples which, we think, very well explain this. Let us ponder over these examples. Everybody knows that during the reign of Louis XV, military affairs went steadily from bad to worse in France. As Henri Martin has observed, during the 7 Years' War, the French army, which always had numerous prostitutes, tradesmen and servants in its train, and which had 3 times as many pack horses as saddle horses, had more resemblance to the hordes of Darius and Xerxes than to the armies of Turenne and Gustavus Adolphus. 30 Archenholz says in his history of this war that the French officers, when appointed for guard duty, often deserted their posts to go dancing somewhere in the vicinity, and obeyed the orders of their superiors only when they thought fit. This deplorable state of military affairs was due to the deterioration of the aristocracy, which, however, continued to occupy all the high posts in the army, and to the general dislocation of the old order, which was rapidly drifting to its doom. These general causes alone would have been quite sufficient to make the outcome of the 7 Years' War unfavorable to France. But undoubtedly the incompetence of generals like Soubise greatly increased the chances of failure for the French army, which these general causes already provided. Soubise retained his post, thanks to Madame Pompadour. And so we must count the proud Marquise as one of the factors, significantly reinforcing the unfavorable influence of these general causes on the position of French affairs. The Marquise de Pompadour was strong not by her own strength, but by the power of the king who was subject to her will. Can we say that the character of Louis XV was exactly what it was inevitably bound? 30. Histoire de France, 4M edition, T. Kempf, pp. 521. 68. Chapter 6. To be, in view of the general course of development of social relations in France? No. Given the same course of development, a king might have appeared in his place with a different attitude towards women. Sainte-Beuve would say that the action of obscure and intangible physiological causes was sufficient to account for this, and he would be right. But, if that is so, the conclusion emerges that these obscure physiological causes, by affecting the progress and results of the 7 Years' War, also in consequence affected the subsequent development of France, which would have proceeded differently if the 7 Years' War had not deprived her of a great part of her colonies. Does not this conclusion, we then ask, contradict the conception of a social development conforming to laws? No, not in the least. The effect of personal peculiarities in the instances we have discussed is undeniable, but no less undeniable is the fact that it could occur only in the given social conditions. After the Battle of Rosbach, the French became fiercely indignant with Soubis's position. Every day she received numbers of anonymous letters, full of threats and abuse. This very seriously disturbed Madame Pompadour. She began to suffer from insomnia. 31, nevertheless, she continued to protect Soubise. In 1762, she remarked in one of her letters to him that he was not justifying the hopes that had been placed in him, but she added, "Have no fear, however, I will take care of your interests and try to reconcile you with the king." 32, as you see. She did not yield to public opinion. Why did she not yield? Probably because French society of that day had no means of compelling her to do so. But why was French society of that day unable to do so? It was prevented from doing so by its form of organization, which in turn was determined by the relation of social forces in France at that time. Hence, it is the relation of social forces which, in the last analysis, explains the fact that Louis XV's character and the caprices of his favorite could have such a deplorable influence on the fate of France. Had it not been the king who had a weakness for the fair sex, but the king's cook or groom, it would not. 31. CFF. Mémoire de Madame du Hossay, Paris, 1824. p. 181. 32. Cf. at Lettres de la Marquise de Pompadour, London, 1772. T. I. 69. The role of the individual in history have had any historical significance. Clearly, it is not the weakness that is important here, but the social position of the person afflicted with it. The reader will understand that these arguments can be applied to all the above quoted examples. In these arguments, it is necessary to change only what needs changing, for example, to put Russia in the place of France, Butelin in place of Soubise, etc. That is why we will not repeat them. It follows, then, that by virtue of particular traits of their character, individuals can influence the fate of society. Sometimes this influence is very considerable, but the possibility of exercising this influence and its extent are determined by the form of organization of society, by the relation of forces within it. The character of an individual is a factor in social development only where, when, and to the extent that social relations permit it to be such. We may be told that the extent of personal influence may also be determined by the talents of the individual. We agree. But the individual can display his talents only when he occupies the position in society necessary for this. Why was the fate of France in the hands of a man who totally lacked the ability and desire to serve society? Because such was the form of organization of that society. It is the form of organization that in any given period determines the role, and consequently the social significance that may fall to the lot of talented or incompetent individuals. But if the role of individuals is determined by the form of organization of society, how can their social influence, which is determined by the role they play, contradict the conception of social development as a process expressing laws? It does not contradict it. On the contrary, it serves as one of its most vivid illustrations. But here we must observe the following. The possibility, determined by the form of organization of society, that individuals may exercise social influence, opens the door to the influence of so-called accident upon the historical destiny of nations. Louis XV's lasciviousness was an inevitable consequence of the state of his physical constitution, but in relation to the general course of France's development. 70. Chapter 6. The state of his constitution was accidental. Nevertheless, as we have said, it did influence the fate of France and served as one of the causes which determined this fate. The death of Mirabeau, of course, was due to pathological processes which obeyed definite laws. The inevitability of these processes, however, did not arise out of the general course of France's development, but out of certain particular features of the celebrated orator's constitution, and out of the physical conditions under which he had contracted his disease. In relation to the general course of France's development, these features and conditions were accidental, and yet Mirabeau's death influenced the further course of the revolution and served as one of the causes which determined it. Still more astonishing was the effect of accidental causes in the above-mentioned example of Frederick II, who succeeded in extricating himself from an extremely difficult situation only because of Butterlin's irresolution. Even in relation to the general cause of Russia's development, Butterlin's appointment may have been accidental, in the sense that we have defined that term, and, of course, it had no relation whatever to the general course of Prussia's development. Yet it is not improbable that Butterlin's irresolution saved Frederick from a desperate situation. Had Suvorov been in Butterlin's place, the history of Prussia might have taken a different course. It follows, then, that sometimes the fate of nations depends on accidents, which may be called accidents of the second degree. In allem Endlichen ist ein Element des Zufälligen. Said Hegel, in everything finite there are accidental elements. In science we deal only with the finite, hence we can say that all the processes studied by science contain some accidental elements. Does not this preclude the scientific cognition of phenomena? No. Accident is something relative. It appears only at the point of intersection of inevitable processes. For the inhabitants of Mexico and Peru, the appearance of Europeans in America was accidental in the sense that it did not follow from the social development of these countries. But the passion for navigation which possessed West Europeans at the end of the Middle Ages was not accidental, nor was the fact that the European forces easily overcame the resistance of the natives. The consequences of the conquest of Mexico. 71. The role of the individual in history. And Peru by Europeans were also not accidental. In the last analysis, these consequences were determined by the resultant of two forces: the economic position of the conquered countries on the one hand, and the economic position of the conquerors on the other. And these forces, like their resultant, can fully serve as objects of scientific investigation. The accidents of the 7 Years' War exercised considerable influence upon the subsequent history of Prussia, but their influence would have been entirely different at a different stage of Prussia's development. Here, too, the accidental consequences were determined by the resultant of two forces: the social-political conditions of Prussia on the one hand, and the social-political condition of the European countries that influenced her on the other. Hence, here, too, accidents do not in the least hinder the scientific investigation of phenomena. We know now that individuals often exercise considerable influence upon the fate of society, but this influence is determined by the internal structure of that society and by its relation to other societies. But this is not all that has to be said about the role of the individual in history. We must approach this question from still another side. Sainte de Beauve thought that had there been a sufficient number of petty and dark causes of the kind that he had mentioned, the outcome of the French Revolution would have been the opposite of what we know it to have been. This is a great mistake. No matter how intricately the petty, psychological, and physiological causes may have been interwoven, they would not under any circumstances have eliminated the great social needs that gave rise to the French Revolution. And as long as these needs remained unsatisfied, the revolutionary movement in France would have continued. To make the outcome of this movement the opposite of what it was, the needs that gave rise to it would have had to be the opposite of what they were. And this, of course, no combination of petty causes would ever be able to bring about. The causes of the French Revolution lay in the character of the social relations, and the petty causes assumed by Sainte Beuve could lie only in the personal qualities of individuals. The final cause of social relationships lies in the state of the productive forces. This depends on 72. Chapter 6. The qualities of individuals only in the sense, perhaps, that these individuals possess more or less talent for making technical improvements, discoveries, and inventions. Sainte-Beuve did not have these qualities in mind. No other qualities, however, enable individuals directly to influence the state of productive forces, and hence the social relations which they determine, i.e., economic relations. No matter what the qualities of the given individual may be, they cannot eliminate the given economic relations if the latter conform to the given state of productive forces. But the personal qualities of individuals make them more or less fit to satisfy those social needs which arise out of the given economic relations, or to counteract such satisfaction. The urgent social need of France at the end of the 18th century was the substitution for the obsolete political institutions of new institutions that would conform more to her economic system. The most prominent and useful public men of that time were those who were more capable than others of helping to satisfy this most urgent need. We will assume that Mirabeau, Robespierre, and Napoleon were men of that type. What would have happened had premature death not removed Mirabeau from the political stage? The constitutional monarchist party would have retained its considerable power for a longer period. Its resistance to the Republicans would, therefore, have been more energetic. But that is all. No Mirabeau could, at that time, have averted the triumph of the Republicans. Mirabeau's power rested entirely on the sympathy and confidence of the people. But the people wanted a republic, as the court irritated them by its obstinate defense of the old order. As soon as the people had become convinced that Mirabeau did not sympathize with their republican strivings, they would have ceased to sympathize with him. And then the great orator would have lost nearly all influence, and in all probability would have fallen a victim to the very movement that he would vainly have tried to check. Approximately the same thing may be said about Robespierre. Let us assume that he was an absolutely indispensable force in his party, but even so, he was not the only force. If the accidental fall of a brick had killed him, say, in January 1793.33, his place would, of course, have course. 33. King Louis XVI was guillotined on January 21st, 1793. 73. The role of the individual in history been taken by somebody else, and although this person might have been inferior to him in every respect, nevertheless, events would have taken the same course as they did when Robespierre was alive. For example, even under these circumstances, the Gironde 34 would probably not have escaped defeat. But it is possible that Robespierre's party would have lost power somewhat earlier, and we would now be speaking not of the Thermidor reaction, but of the Floreal, Prairial, or Messidor reaction. Perhaps some will say that with his inexorable terror, Robespierre did not delay but hastened the downfall of his party. We will not stop to examine this supposition here. We will accept it as if it were quite sound. In that case, we must assume that Robespierre's party would have fallen not in Thermidor, but in Fructidor, Vendémiain, or Brumaire. In short, it may have fallen sooner, or perhaps later, but it certainly would have fallen, because the section of the people which supported Robespierre's party was totally unprepared to hold power for a prolonged period. At all events, results opposite to those which arose from Robespierre's energetic action are out of the question, nor could they have arisen even if Bonaparte had been struck down by a bullet. Let us say, at the Battle of Arcole. 36. What he did in the Italian and other campaigns other generals would have done. Probably they would not have displayed the same talent as he did, and would not have achieved such brilliant victories. Nevertheless, the French Republic would have emerged victorious from the wars it waged at that time, because its soldiers were incomparably the best in Europe. As for the 18th of Brumaire 37 and its influence on the internal life of France, here, 34. The Gironde, a party of the big bourgeoisie at the time of the French Revolution, 35. The Thermidor reaction, the period of political and social reaction following the counter-revolutionary coup in France on July 27, 1794. 9. Thermidor, which put an end to the Jacobin dictatorship, its leader Robespierre being executed. Thermidor, Floreal, Prairial, Messidor, Brumaire, etc. Names of months in the Republican calendar introduced by the convention in the autumn of 1793. 36. The Battle of Arcole, fought between French and Austrian armies, took place on November 17th, 1796. 37. The 18th Brumaire, November 9th, 1799, the day of the coup d'etat carried out by Napoleon Bonaparte. The Directoire, was replaced by the consulate, and subsequently led to the establishment of the empire. 74. Chapter 6. 2. In essence, the general course and outcome of events would probably have been the same as they were under Napoleon. The Republic, mortally wounded by the events of the 9th of Thermidor, was slowly dying. The Directoire 38 was unable to restore order, which the bourgeoisie, having rid itself of the rule of the aristocracy, now desired most of all. To restore order, a good sword, as C.S. expressed it, was needed. At first it was thought that General Jourdan would serve in this virtuous role. But when he was killed at Novi, the names of Moreau, Macdonald, and Bernadotte were mentioned. Bonaparte was only mentioned later, and had he been killed, like Jourdan, he would not have been mentioned at all, and some other sword would have been put forward. It goes without saying that the man whom events had elevated to the position of dictator must have been tirelessly aspiring to power himself, energetically pushing aside and ruthlessly crushing all who stood in his way. Bonaparte was a man of iron energy, and was remorseless in the pursuit of his goal, but there were not a few energetic, talented, and ambitious egoists in those days besides him. The place Bonaparte succeeded in occupying would, probably, not have remained vacant. Let us assume that the other general who had secured this place would have been more peaceful than Napoleon, that he would not have roused the whole of Europe against himself, and therefore would have died in the Tuileries and not on the island of St. Helena. In that case, the Bourbons would not have returned to France at all. For them, such a result would certainly have been the opposite of what it was. In its relation to the internal life of France as a whole, however, this result would have differed little from the actual result. After the good sword had restored order and had consolidated the power of the bourgeoisie, the latter would have tired soon of its barrack-room habits and despotism. A liberal movement would have arisen, similar to the one that arose after the Restoration. The fight would have gradually flared up, and as good swords are not distinguished for their yielding nature. 38. The Directoire. The government established in France after the coup of 9 Thermidor, July 27. It lasted from October 1795 till November 1799. 39. La vie en France sous le Premier Empire, by de Broc, Paris, 1895, pp. 35, 6, et CQ, Terroirs. 75. The role of the individual in history. The virtuous Louis-Philippe would, perhaps, have ascended the throne of his dearly beloved kinsman, not in 1830, but in 1820, or in 1825. All such changes in the course of events might, to some extent, have influenced the subsequent political, and through it, the economic life of Europe. Nevertheless, under no circumstances would the final outcome of the revolutionary movement have been the opposite of what it was. Owing to the specific qualities of their minds and characters, influential individuals can change the individual features of events and some of their particular consequences, but they cannot change their general trend, which is determined by other forces. 76. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Furthermore, we must also note the following. In discussing the role great men play in history, we nearly always fall victims to a sort of optical illusion, to which it will be useful to draw the reader's attention. In coming out in the role of the good sword to save public order, Napoleon prevented all the other generals from playing this role, and some of them might have performed it in the same way, or almost the same way, as he did. Once the public need for an energetic military ruler was satisfied, The social organization barred the road to the position of military ruler for all other talented soldiers. Its power became a power that was unfavorable to the appearance of other talents of a similar kind. This is the cause of the optical illusion, which we have mentioned. Napoleon's personal power presents itself to us in an extremely magnified form, for we place to his account the social power which had brought him to the front and supported him. Napoleon's power appears to us to be something quite exceptional, because the other power similar to it did not pass from the potential to the real. And when we are asked, what would have happened if there had been no Napoleon? Our imagination becomes confused, and it seems to us that without him the social movement upon which his power and influence were based could not have taken place. In the history of the development of human intellect, the success of some individual hinders the success of another individual very much more rarely. But even here we are not free from the above-mentioned optical illusion. When a given state of society sets certain problems before its intellectual representatives, the attention of prominent minds is concentrated upon them until these problems are solved. As soon as they have succeeded in solving them, their attention is transferred to another object. By solving a problem, a given talent diverts the attention of talent B from the problem already solved to another problem. And when we are asked, what would have happened if A had died before he had solved problem X, we imagine that the thread of development of the human intellect would have been broken. We foreign. 77. The role of the individual in history. Get that had A died, B or C or D might have tackled the problem, and the thread of intellectual development would have remained intact in spite of his premature demise. In order that a man who possesses a particular kind of talent may, by means of it, greatly influence the course of events, two conditions are needed. First, this talent must make him more conformable to the social needs of the given epoch than anyone else. If Napoleon had possessed the musical gifts of Beethoven instead of his own military genius, he would not, of course, have become an emperor. Second, the existing social order must not bar the road to the person possessing the talent which is needed and useful precisely at the given time. This very Napoleon would have died as the barely known general, or colonel, Bonaparte, had the old order in France existed another 75 years. In 1789, Devout, Dese, Marmont and MacDonald were subalterns. Bernadotte was a sergeant major. Hocquet, Marceau, Lefebvre, Pichegru, Ney Massena, Murat and Soult were non-commissioned officers. Augereau was a fencing master. Lannes was a dyer. Gouvion Saint-Cyr was an actor. Jourdan was a peddler. Bessieres was a barber. Brune was a compositor. Joubert and Junot were law students. Kleber was an architect. Marrier did not see any military service until the Revolution. 41. Had the old order continued to exist up to our days, it would never have occurred to any of us that in France, at the end of the last century, certain actors, compositors, barbers, dyers, lawyers, peddlers and fencing masters had been potential military geniuses. 42. Stendhal observed that a man who was born at the same time as Titian, i.e., in 1477, could have lived 40 years with Raphael, who died in 1520, and with Leonardo da Vinci, who died in 1519. That he could 40. Probably Napoleon would have gone to Russia, where he had intended to go just a few years before the Revolution. Here, no doubt, he would have distinguished himself in action against the Turks or the Caucasian Highlanders. But nobody here would have thought that this poor but capable officer could, under favorable circumstances, have become the ruler of the world. 41. Cf. at Histoire de France. V. Dury. Paris, 1893. T. 2nd. pp. 524-5. 42. In the reign of Louis XV, only one representative of the Third Estate, Chevert. More difficult for members of this estate to make a military career. Cf. 1. Rimbaud, Thiers, Histoire de la Civilisation Française, could rise to the rank of lieutenant general. In the reign of Louis XVI, it was even 6th edition, T. Dutton, p. 226, 78, chapter 7, have spent many years with Correggio, who died in 1534, and with Michelangelo, who lived until 1563, that he would have been no more than 34 years of age when Giorgione died, that he could have been acquainted with Tintoretto, Bassano, Veronese, Julian Romano, and Andrea del Sarto. That, in short, he would have been the contemporary of all the great painters, with the exception of those who belonged to the Bologna school, which arose a full century later. Similarly, it may be said that a man who was born in the same year as Woermann could have been personally acquainted with nearly all the great Dutch painters. 44, and a man of the same age as Shakespeare would have been the contemporary of a number of remarkable playwrights. 45. It has long been observed that great talents appear everywhere. Whenever the social conditions favorable to their development exist, this means that every man of talent who actually appears, i.e., every man of talent who becomes a social force, is the product of social relations. Since this is the case, it is clear why talented people can, as we have said, change only individual features of events, but not their general trend. They are themselves the product of this trend. Were it not for that trend, they would never have crossed the threshold that divides the potential from the real. It goes without saying that there is talent and talent. When a fresh step in the development of civilization calls into being a new form of art, rightly says Taine, scores of talents who only half express social thought appear around one or two geniuses who express it perfectly. 46. 43. Histoire de la peinture en Italie, Paris 1889, pp. or 23.5. 44. Terburg, Brouwer, and Rembrandt were born in 1608. Adrian van Ostade and Ferdinand Bol were born in 1610. Van der Holst and Gerard Dow were born in 1615. Wouwerman was born in 1620. Wemmix, Everdingen, and Toeniker were born in 1621. Berghem was born in 1624 and Paul Potter in 1629. Jan Steen was born in 1626. Ruysdael and Metsu were born in 1630. Van der Heyden was born in 1637. Habema was born in 1638, and Adrian van der Velde was born in 1638, and Adrian van der Velde. 45. Shakespeare, Beaumont, Fletcher, Johnson, Webster, Massinger, Ford, Middleton, and Heywood, who appeared at the same time, or following each other, represented the new generation which, owing to its favorable position, flourished on the soil which had been prepared by the efforts of the preceding generation. Taine, Histoire de la littérature anglaise, Paris, 1863. T. IP 468. 46. Taine. Histoire de la littérature anglaise. Paris, 18 Tekken, p. 79. The role of the individual in history. If, owing to certain mechanical or physiological causes unconnected with the general course of the social, political, and intellectual development of Italy, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci had died in their infancy, Italian art would have been less perfect, but the general trend of its development in the period of the Renaissance would have remained the same. Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo did not create this trend. They were merely its best representatives. True, usually a whole school springs up around a man of genius, and his pupils try to copy his methods to the minutest detail. That is why the gap that would have been left in Italian art in the period of the Renaissance by the early death of Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci would have strongly influenced many of the secondary features of its subsequent history. But in essence, there would have been no change in this history, provided there were no important change in the general course of the intellectual development of Italy, due to general causes. It is well known, however, that quantitative differences ultimately pass into qualitative differences. This is true everywhere, and is therefore true in history. A given trend in art may remain without any remarkable expression if an unfavorable combination of circumstances carries away, one after the other, several talented people who might have given it expression. But the premature death of such talented people can prevent the artistic expression of this trend, only if it is too shallow to produce new talent. As, however, the depth of any given trend in literature and art is determined by its importance for the class, or stratum, whose tastes it expresses, and by the social role played by that class or stratum. Here, too, in the last analysis, everything depends upon the course of social development and on the relation of social forces. 80. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. Thus, the personal qualities of leading people determine the individual features of historical events, and the accidental element, in the sense that we have indicated, always plays some role in the course of these events, the trend of which is determined in the last analysis by so-called general causes, i.e., actually, by the development of productive forces and the mutual relations between men in the social-economic process of production. Casual phenomena and the personal qualities of celebrated people are ever so much more noticeable than deep-lying general causes. The 18th century pondered but little over these general causes, and claimed that history was explained by the conscious actions and passions of historical personages. The philosophers of that century asserted that history might have taken an entirely different course as a result of the most insignificant causes. For example, if some atom had started playing pranks in some ruler's head, an idea expressed more than once in Système de la Nature, the adherents of the new trend in the science of history began to argue that history could not have taken any other course than the one it has taken, notwithstanding all atoms. Striving to emphasize the effect of general causes as much as possible, they ignored the personal qualities of historical personages. According to their argument, historical events would not have been affected in the least by the substitution of some persons for others, more or less capable. 47. But if we make such an assumption, then we must admit that the personal element is of no significance whatever in history, and that everything can be reduced to the operation of general causes, to the general laws of historical progress. This would be going to an extreme which leaves no room for the particle of truth contained in the opposite opinion. It is precisely for this reason that the opposite opinion retains some right to existence. 47. According to their argument, i.e., when they began to discuss the tendency of historical events to conform to laws, when, however, some of them simply described these phenomena, they sometimes ascribed even exaggerated significance to the personal element. What interests us now, however, are not their descriptions, but their arguments. 81. The role of the individual in history. Collision between these two opinions assumed the form of an antinomy, the first part of which was general laws, and the second part was the activities of individuals. From the point of view of the second part of the antinomy, history was simply a chain of accidents. From the point of view of the first part, it seemed that even the individual features of historical events were determined by the operation of general causes. But if the individual features of events are determined by the influence of general causes, and do not depend upon the personal qualities of historical personages, it follows that these features are determined by general causes and cannot be changed, no matter how much these personages may change. Thus, the theory assumes a fatalistic character. This did not escape the attention of its opponents. Sainte-Beuve compared Mignot's conception of history with that of Bossuet. Bossuet thought that the force which causes historical events to take place comes from above, that events serve to express the divine will. Magnet sought for this force in the human passions, which are displayed in historical events as inexorably and immutably as the forces of nature. But both regarded history as a chain of phenomena, which could not have been different, no matter under what circumstances. Both were fatalists. In this respect, the philosopher was not far removed from the priest. Le philosophe se rapproche du prêtre. This reproach was justified as long as the doctrine that social phenomena conform to certain laws reduced the influence of the personal qualities of prominent historical individuals to a cipher. And the impression made by this reproach was all the more strong for the reason that the historians of the new school, like the historians and philosophers of the 18th century, regarded human nature as a higher instance, from which all the general causes of historical movement sprang, and to which they were subordinated. As the French Revolution had shown that historical events are not determined by the conscious actions of men alone, Magnet and Guizot, and the other historians of the same trend, put in the forefront the effect of the passions, which often rebelled against all control of the mind. But if the passions are the final and most general cause of historical events, then why is 82, Chapter 8, Sainte-Beuve wrong in asserting that the outcome of the French Revolution might have been the opposite of what we know it was, if there had been individuals capable of imbuing the French people with passions opposite to those which have de-excited them? Magnet would have said, because other passions could not have excited the French people at that time, owing to the very qualities of human nature. In a certain sense, this would have been true. But this truth would have had a strongly fatalistic tinge, for it would have been on a par with the thesis that the history of mankind, in all its details, is predetermined by the general qualities of human nature. Fatalism would have appeared here as the result of the disappearance of the individual in the general. Incidentally, it is always the result of such a disappearance. It is said, if all social phenomena are inevitable, then our activities cannot have any significance. This is a correct idea wrongly formulated. We ought to say, if everything occurs as a result of the general, then the individual, including my efforts, is of no significance. This deduction is correct, but it is incorrectly employed. It is senseless when applied to the modern materialist conception of history, in which there is room also for the individual. But it was justified when applied to the views of the French historians in the period of the Restoration. At the present time, human nature can no longer be regarded as the final and most general cause of historical progress. If it is constant, then it cannot explain the extremely changeable course of history. If it is changeable, then obviously its changes are themselves determined by historical progress. At the present time, we must regard the development of productive forces as the final and most general cause of the historical progress of mankind. And it is these productive forces that determine the consecutive changes in the social relations of men. Parallel with this general cause, there are particular causes, i.e., the historical situation in which the development of the productive forces of a given nation proceeds and in which, in the last analysis, is itself created by the development of these forces among other nations, i.e., the same general cause. Finally, the influence of the particular causes is supplemented by the operation of individual causes, i.e., the personal qualities of Pabau and Humor. 83. The role of the individual in history. Like men and other accidents, thanks to which events finally assume their individual features, individual causes cannot bring about fundamental changes in the operation of general and particular causes, which, moreover, determine the trend and limits of the influence of individual causes. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that history would have had different features had the individual causes which had influenced it been replaced by other causes of the same order. Monod and Lamprecht still adhere to the human nature point of view. Lamprecht has categorically, and more than once, declared that in his opinion social mentality is the fundamental cause of historical phenomena. This is a great mistake, and as a result of this mistake the desire, very laudable in itself, to take into account the sum total of social life may lead only to vapid eclecticism, or among the most consistent, to Cabot's arguments concerning the relative significance of the mind and the senses. But let us return to our subject. A great man is great not because his personal qualities give individual features to great historical events, but because he possesses qualities which make him most capable of serving the great social needs of his time, needs which arose as a result of general and particular causes. Carlyle, in his well-known book on heroes and hero worship, calls great men beginners. This is a very apt description. A great man is precisely a beginner because he sees further than others and desires things more strongly than others. He solves the scientific problems brought up by the preceding process of intellectual development of society. He points to the new social needs created by the preceding development of social relationship. He takes the initiative in satisfying these needs. He is a hero, but he is not a hero in the sense that he can stop or change the natural course of things, but in the sense that his activities are the conscious and free expression of this inevitable and unconscious course. Herein lays all his significance. Herein lies his whole power. But this significance is colossal, and the power is terrible. Bismarck said that we cannot make history and must wait while it is being made. But who makes history? It is made by the social man, who is its sole factor. The social man creates his own, i.e., social rela. 84. Chapter 8. Tea and ships. But if in a given period he creates given relationships and not others, there must be some cause for it, of course. It is determined by the state of his productive forces. No great man can foist on society relations which no longer conform to the state of these forces, or which do not yet conform to them. In this sense, indeed, he cannot make history, and in this sense he would advance the hands of his clock in vain. He would not hasten the passage of time, nor turn it back. Here Lamprecht is quite right. Even at the height of his power, Bismarck could not cause Germany to revert to natural economy. Social relationships have their inherent logic. As long as people live in given mutual relationships, they will reel, think, and act in a given way, and no other. Attempts on the part of public men to combat this logic would also be fruitless. The natural course of things, i.e., this logic of social relationships, would reduce all his efforts to naught. But if I know in what direction social relations are changing, owing to given changes in the social economic process of production, I also know in what direction social mentality is changing. Consequently, I am able to influence it. Influencing social mentality means influencing historical events. Hence, in a certain sense, I can make history, and there is no need for me to wait while it is being made. No, Monod believes that really important events and individuals in history are important only as signs and symbols of the development of institutions and economic conditions. This is a correct, although very inexactly expressed idea, but precisely because this idea is correct, it is wrong to oppose the activities of great men to the slow progress of the conditions and institutions mentioned. The more or less slow changes in economic conditions periodically confront society with the necessity of more or less rapidly changing its institutions. This change never takes place by itself. It always needs the intervention of men, who are thus confronted with great social problems, and it is those men who do more than others to facilitate the solution of these problems who are called great men. But solving a problem does not mean being only a symbol and a sign of the fact that it has been solved. We think that Monod opposed the one to the other, mainly. 85. The role of the individual in history, because he was carried away by the pleasant catchword, slow. Many modern evolutionists are very fond of this catchword. Psychologically, this passion is comprehensible. It inevitably arises in the respectable milieu of moderation and punctiliousness. But logically, it does not bear examination, as Hegel proved. And it is not only for beginners, not only for great men, that a broad field of activity is open. It is open for all of those who have eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts to love their neighbors. The concept great is a relative concept. In the ethical sense, every man is great who, to use the biblical phrase, lays down his life for his friend. 86. Collection, Colorful Classics 14. Urban Perspective. Communist Party of India. 1. Maoist. Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Basic. Course, Revised Edition 15. 5 Essays on Philosophy. Communist Party of India. Mao Zedong. Maoist. 16. Postmodernism Today. 2. Siraj Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement 17. The National Question. Anuradha Gandhi Ibrahim Kaipakaya. 3 Tahu. 18 Town. Historic. 8 Documents. Mini-Manual of the Urban Guerrilla. Carlos Marighella Caru Mazumdar. 4. 19 Tar. A New Outlook on Health, the Communist Necessity. J. Mufawad Paul Advocators. 5. 20. Basic Principles of Marxism, Maoists in India. Writings and Interviews, Leninism. A Primer. Azad Jose Maria Sison. 6. 21. Toward a Scientific Analysis of the 5 Golden Rays. Mao Zedong Gay Question. 7. Los Angeles Research Group. Stand for Socialism Against Modern Revisionism. 22 Tara. Activists Study Aeroline. Activista. Armando Liwanag. Ara. 8. Taught. Padapa Strategy for the Liberation of Palestine Collection. Works of Maoism. Felt. 9 Tartar To. Teusus. Paratarkarani. 1 Dar. Collected Works. 1968 to 1987. Against Avakianism. Ajith Communist Party of Peru. 10 Hall. 2. Selected Works. Volume 6. Specific Characteristics of Our Peoples. War Mao. Zedong. Jose Maria Sison 3. Selected Works. Volume 7. 11. Mao Zedong Rethinking Socialism. What is Socialist Transition? 4. Selected Works. Volume 8. Deng Yuan Hoshu and Pao Yu Ching Mao Tse Tung. 12. Feda Guerrillas Speak on Armed 5. Selected Works. Volume 9. Struggle in Iran. Mao Tse Tung. Degani. Ahmadzadeh. Habash. 6. Pretoria. Selected Works. Volume 9. Puyan. Ashraf Mao Zedong. 13. Evan. Alan. Selected Readings from the Works, Revolutionary Works. Simos Costello, Jose Maria Sison. Collection, New Roads. 3. Reform or Revolution. Rosa Luxemburg. Once. 1. 4. Socialism. Utopian and Scientific from Victory to Defeat. China's Socialist Road and Capitalist Frederick Engels. Reversal 5. The State and Revolution. Pao Yu Ching Wei Lenin. 2. 6. Labor in Irish History, Silage Choppers and Snake Spirits. Dao Yuan Chu James Connolly. 3. 7. Tornado. Anarchism or Socialism. Which East is Red? Andrew Smith and Trotskyism or Leninism. 4. 3. Joseph Stalin Mao Zedong's On Contradiction. Study Companion 8. Dutchow. Manifesto of the Communist Party. Red Spark Collective and Principles of Communism. 5. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, Critique of Maoist Reason. J. Mufawad Paul 9. Essays in Historical Materialism. 6. George Plekhanov, like Ho Chi Minh. like Che Guevara. 10. The Fascist Offensive and Unity of the War. Ian Scott Horst Working Class. 7. George Dimitrov Critiquing Brahmanism. K. Morali, Aegith. 11. Imperialism, the highest stage. 8. Of Capitalism Operation. Green Hunt. Adolfo Naya Fernandez, Afuatay Linen. 9. 12. The Origin of the Family. Private of Concepts and Methods. K. Morali, Aegith. Property and the State. And then Frederick Engels, The German Communist Resistance. T. Durbin 13. Tar. The Housing Question. Collection, Foundations, 14. Frederick Engels, The Modern Prince and Other Writings. 1. 1. The Foundations of Leninism, Antonio Gramsci. Joseph Stalin, 15th. What is to be done? 2. Wage Labor and Capital and Wages v. I. Lenin. Price and Profit. Karl Marx. Achève d'imprimer par courrier numérique. Z.A. Charles Tellier. 14,110. Condé and Normandie. No d'imprimeur. 150,579. Dépôt légal. Mars 2021. Imprimé en France.